May 40 here. So when people do you dirty, I think there's a near universal amount of outrage. And when you go to church, you don't expect to get lectured on politics. And that's what happened to Donald Trump and his family and J.D. Vance yesterday. They show up to church for this tradition, right? You go to the National Cathedral on your first full day in office after the inauguration, and he gets lectured by this left-wing bishop. So if you're walking down the street and someone tackles you, you feel like, oh, that's not on, mate. That's not fair play. Now, if you're playing a game of football and you're carrying the football and someone tackles you, that is fair play. Right, so when you're prepared for someone to throw a punch at you, you're in a boxing ring, then you're not outraged when someone throws a punch at you. But you go to church, and Donald Trump doesn't go to church very much, and this left-wing bishop just launches into a long political diatribe. It's not on. I hate people who abuse authority. I hate people who abuse religious authority. I grew up the son of a preacher man, and it was just clarified to me by a rabbi who I'd written about, and he'd been in various sex scandals. And the rabbi said something very wise to me. He said, when I read your blog, I get the feeling that somebody abused religious authority with regard to you very early on in your life, and you're still mad at that. And it's like, yeah. So sometimes my father would use his religious authority to provide reprimands for people, and sometimes he did it very well. And this bishop, she could have done it well. She could have said something that gotten her point across that could have been heard by most of the country, but she chose to do it in just very plainly partisan terms. And no wonder that Donald Trump and company are upset, and I'd be upset too. It's an abuse of religious authority. I would have walked out. I do not sit still for these kind of bloody elections.
Has just passed, and woken federal bureaucrats are fleeing their offices. Much more on that later. But first to the bishop who turned her lectern into a sermon on wokeness. Marianne Budd hijacking the sacred prayer service at the National Cathedral with President Trump and J.D. Vance in attendance, thinking it was the perfect place to preach her progressive gospel.
There are gay, lesbian, and transgender children in Democratic, Republican, and independent families. Some who fear for their lives. And the people who pick our crops and clean our office buildings, who labor in poultry.
If you fear for your life because you're gay or lesbian in America, I don't think you're in reality.
Farms and meatpacking plants, who wash the dishes after we eat in restaurants and work the night shifts in hospitals, they may not be citizens or have the proper documentation. But the vast majority of immigrants.
So let's say, Bishop, you go home to your place and you turn off the lights and you get into bed and there's someone in your bed, right, who's not supposed to be in your bed. Would you be outraged or would you be compassionate? Just imagine all the fear that person in your bed is feeling right now.
Immigrants are not criminals.
But what this woke bishop didn't count on is that President Trump is one heck of a counterpuncher. 47 going scorched earth on the nasty clergywoman, calling her service boring and uninspiring, and adding that she and the church owed the public an apology. And no surprise here, the woke bishop is capitalizing on her newfound fame, making all the stops to liberal outlets like CNN, and then worshiping with the 5 disciples of The View.
Unity requires a certain degree of mercy and compassion and understanding. We need to be merciful, and I was trying to counter the narrative that is so divisive and polarizing, and in which people...
That's not your job. You don't have any expertise on national immigration policy. There's nothing in your religious training that gave you expertise on immigration policy. Shut up, woman.
Real people are being harmed. How could it not be politicized, right? We're in a hyper-political climate. I was trying to speak a truth that I felt needed to be said, but to do it in as respectful and kind.
you felt that this truth needed to be said. How do you know it's true? How do you have any expertise on what makes for proper immigration policy? And how is it your role to lecture the president on this?
Away as I could.
All right, Jesse. He's not even 24 hours into his presidency, and it's such an opportunity. I mean, there they are at the National Cathedral, and everything was very unified. You know, it was when you saw the luncheon and you saw people in Congress. I mean, it was a...
And I got into Judaism. I didn't immediately embrace Orthodox Judaism. All right. I was attracted to Judaism by Dennis Prager, who is not Orthodox and for many decades attended a Reform synagogue. So I had no particular commitment to Orthodox Judaism when I started my Jewish journey. It's just that the non-Orthodox movements in Judaism, like the non-traditional movements in Christianity, have just been overwhelmingly taken over by the left. And if you're not a leftist, right, and you don't want to go to synagogue, you don't want to go to church, you don't want to make a prime center of your social life, some place that's filled with leftists, all right, you have to become, if you're Jewish, an Orthodox Jew, or if you're Christian, right, you have to go with some more traditional rather than mainstream choice.
Unity event, and it was stained by this bishop.
And it's like the one time Trump goes to church. The one time. And he gets lectured. That's why he plays golf on Sunday. Because if he wanted to get lectured by a skinny liberal woman, he'd just watch Maddow. He is a Presbyterian. You take a big risk when you go into an Episcopalian service. Let this be a lesson to you. Pastor Jeffers said something very poignant. She insulted rather than encouraged the president. She said that trans and illegals are scared. Well, what about Lake and Riley? She was scared. What about Riley Gaines? She was scared. I don't think this bishop ever talked about those two women. I wouldn't know because I'm not in her service, though. Christianity is a rules-based religion, as are most religions. They have the 10 Commandments. Don't do this, don't do that. So when you apply to become a citizen of another country, you wait in line. What if someone went to communion at this bishop's service, cut the whole line, guzzled the blood of Christ, stole the body of Christ, and then slapped her in the face? Would she have mercy on that person? No. You don't run a confessional like you run a country. What she's doing is she's exploiting mercy in order to judge Donald Trump. You can be merciful, but that doesn't mean you just give blanket amnesty to everybody. And we don't want to have compassion at the expense of civilization, because this woman's compassion wreaks havoc on our borders, our sovereignty, our bathrooms, our privacy. She's lucky this didn't happen on day one when he was a dictator, because he would have put her in prison.
You know, Dana, it's the left that's always talking about, you know, the separation of church and state.
Right. You don't tend to get these lectures on politics in more traditional houses of worship.
There's no separation there.
Years and years ago, when I worked on Capitol Hill, I went to a church on Capitol Hill, and I loved it. And I loved my singles group. We used to meet every Wednesday, and on Thursdays we would do the volunteer work together. We loved it. And over time, it was pretty clear that the politics were taking over. And I stopped going, and part of the reason it was this. I like being reminded about mercy and redemption and grace and not judging others. Those are all things that you could have said. But I think what the country just voted on was to say we want less politics in our everyday lives. And you have a serious dearth of people going to church in the United States. A lot of people would have tuned in yesterday. That was a way to be persuasive, like, here's a good place to come and to feel good about yourself, to meet other people, to be in fellowship with your fellow citizens. And instead, I think people were like, wow, you've just pushed politics simply because you've been given the floor, and you were completely unpersuasive.
You know, Harold, she's suggesting that, you know,
Yeah, don't abuse your authority. It can be religious. It can be secular. Don't take advantage of your position to do something that other people haven't consented to. All right, that's a type of rape. Don't rape. Stop raping, please. All right, Peter Zeihan has been predicting the death of China since at least 2005, and he keeps extending the deadline date for when he thinks China will fall apart.
China situation, but from an economic point of view rather than a geopolitical one. Let's review. China's dying. Birth rate has dropped by over half in the last 6 years. They now have more people over age 50 than under, and their workforce is in the early stages of collapse. Their population has been in a state of collapse for over 20 years, but when you run out of people aged 0 to 20, you really don't feel it in your consumption or your investment or your tax base. You're just paying for less education. Well, that has now been going on for 45 years, and they're running out of new people to bring into the system. At the same time, they print currency like mad. Like, you know, what the gold bugs say that the U.S. Federal Reserve does, China actually does, but like times 5. They expand their money supply by about 500% more than the United States has on a monthly basis. And so that drives up asset prices, which makes it more difficult for the young people to do anything, because think about if everyone in the United States was over 40 was buying a vacation home, how hard it would be to start out if you were in your 20s. Now apply that to China. So you've got all this massive real estate build and absolutely no chance that someone young can get in on it. So we are looking at a national collapse here, and a population collapse, and probably a civilizational collapse. The only question is time frame. If I was to put a date on that, and yes, putting dates on things like that is hard, and that is the most difficult part of what I do, I would expect a complete economic breakdown within a decade, and then probably a national breakdown less than 10 years after that.
Okay, so for the last few years, he's been predicting China's demise within 10 years, and he was predicting China's demise within 10 years back in 2005. Now he's saying civilizational breakdown in another 20 years. So that would make it 2045. So about 40 years after the first time that he publicly predicted China's breakdown. Okay, some interesting arguments over January 6th, and some of this grabbed my attention. So there was a lot of tension on yesterday's morning meeting with Mark Halperin over this topic. I just want to play an excerpt here. Mark and Sean Spicer get into
Donald Trump's policies. And that's particularly germane when we come to J6, because I think what they've done politically is very clever. I find this issue divides America as much as anything I've ever covered. The people who are against it feel it's really the worst thing Donald Trump's ever done, and they feel it was disqualifying. And Sean, your party has gone silent. There was a long period of time when people seemed to be morally outraged about what happened and thought it was horrible politics to be supportive of the people who were prosecuted. We can't find a single Republican in the last 12 hours who's spoken out against the pardons. Kind of incredible. We're going to get to that.
I think, again, just to be clear, I mean, a lot's happening. I also, I mean, there's a few things to unpack here. I also don't think that you've seen a lot of people talk about President Biden's pardons publicly.
No, I don't know about that.
No.
Sean, I can give you 1,000 tweets of Democrats putting, and I don't know if you saw my tweet of what Bill Daley told me.
I did. I retweeted it.
So he said it was disgusting. Have you found a single Republican who, and I could give you 1,000 Republicans who a year ago would have said it was disgusting. We can't find a single Republican saying it's disgusting.
Well, again, there's a couple things to break down here. One, it just happened. So let's slow down a little. Two, I think there are people when part of this was I was searching online this morning, trying to distinguish because J.D. Vance and others, as we've discussed before, have talked about the difference between people who perpetrated violence against law enforcement officials and people who were merely there or, didn't committed a sort of what would be considered a misdemeanor offense. I was literally trying to read through because some of the reporting was not very thorough or explanatory when it came to what happened. I stand by the fact that I don't support violence against law enforcement officials. And I think there's a big difference when you dig into this. I've had Alan Dershowitz and others on my podcast. There are a lot of people that got rolled up.
So I didn't want Donald Trump to do mass pardons, but I'm having a second thought on this after reading an article by Mark Caputo in Axios. So here's the headline: Effort, release them all. Why Trump embraced broad January 6 pardons. So Trump was not initially going to go big on pardons. Right, he was going to go on a case-by-case basis, and J.D. Vance 8 days ago said that anyone who assaulted police ought not to get clemency. If you committed violence that day, obviously you wouldn't be pardoned. And Trump vacillated during this internal debate over targeted clemency versus a blanket decision. But as Trump's team wrestled with the issue, all right, eventually they thought, look, it's just going to be easier to pardon them all. and maybe we'll get past this, right? Just as with Gerald Ford's first preemptive presidential pardon, of which I'm aware, where after Richard Nixon resigned, Gerald Ford pardoned him so the country wouldn't get caught up in prosecuting Richard Nixon and torn apart over that. Perhaps these January 6 pardons are the best way to get past January 6. So I have pretty normy views on January 6. I think the riot was terrible, and I would like the rioters prosecuted, just like I would want the Antifa who lit all those fires during Trump's first inauguration. They lit fires. They caused disturbance and damage all over Washington, D.C. the first time Trump was inaugurated in January 2017. And they all got off because Washington, D.C. is dominated by leftists. And there were all those leftists who interrupted the Wisconsin state legislature when Scott Walker was the president. And they weren't prosecuted. Yet massive Black Lives Matter protests that disrupted life in the United States for a long time, and very little prosecution of these Black Lives Matter activists. And so, given all the selective prosecution of political violence in this country, perhaps there is a case for what Donald Trump did. But let's say I just completely disagree with Trump's pardons. Right? To me, it's only a 2 out of 10 level of importance. Right? I don't empathize with those who agree with Donald Trump on 90% of policies and say, oh, I could never vote for Donald Trump because of January 6th. Right. Overall, you have to have a sense of the relative importance of things. Right. I wish that Donald Trump would follow most norms of how a president conducts himself. I wish he didn't launch a meme coin just before he took office. Right. I wish that he didn't contest the 2020 election results, which were clearly showed that he lost. Now, there is a good case to be made that Democrats were successful at changing laws enabling more mail-in voting prior to the 2020 election. But if the Democrats changed the laws successfully and they got Mark Zuckerberg to fund turnout at more Democratic strongholds than at Republican strongholds, so these are legitimate claims, but there's no evidence that votes were switched or were miscounted in the 2020 election. And on a scale of 1 to 10, here is my list of the most important developments in American life over the past 5 years. Biden's foreign policy, 10 out of 10 importance. We're in a mess in Ukraine. We're in a mess in the Middle East. We've talked tough with China, but we haven't created the military to back it up. So we have a Biden administration that has unnecessarily embroiled us into all sorts of conflicts and brought the possibility of war much closer to home. So to me, Biden's foreign policy is the worst foreign policy of any American president in the last 100 years. So to me, that's 10 out of 10 in importance. Then Biden's immigration policy, let's just say 7 out of 10 importance. It's been terrible how he didn't choose to enforce the law. And then once he chose to, because the election was looming, what was it, March of last year, then they were able to significantly reduce the number of illegal immigrants. So he knowingly for 3 years just allowed millions of illegal immigrants to flow into this country. The violent crime problem in this country, I'd say, is a 6 out of 10. Black Lives Matter and the Ferguson effect, at least a 6 out of 10 problem. Biden's economic policy, I'd say that's probably 5 out of 10 in importance. The conspiracy to hide Joe Biden's growing senility, probably 3 out of 10. Biden's preemptive pardons, never done before, except in the case of Gerald Ford for Richard Nixon, 3 out of 10. Donald Trump's failure to follow important norms, you put them all together, including his 2020 election denial, I'd go as high as 3 out of 10. Celebrating trans identity, I'd say 3 out of 10. January 6th, I'd say is a 2 out of 10. COVID, 2 out of 10. Boys playing in girls sports, 2 out of 10. Anti-Semitism in America, 1 out of 10. Fat acceptance, 1 out of 10. So I feel that there's a lack of proportion by those who are rightly outraged over Donald Trump's role in denying the 2020 election result and thus fomenting the January 6 riots.
In this, that literally were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And there is a big difference between grouping everybody together and those who committed violence or acts of violence against a law enforcement official. And I think that we have to be differentiate between those two groups of people.
I said on my show last night, I don't know enough about the individual cases. I'm embarrassed to say. I just haven't had time. But Sean, what you just said is a little bit misleading because we know, even though you're right, the reporting bites. We do know that people got pardons who didn't necessarily commit violence against law enforcement, but they did way more than be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Right? People, 1,500 people got pardoned. I guarantee you, apologies again, I don't know about the individual cases as I should. People were pardoned who did more than just, hey, what am I doing?
But you're saying I was misleading. I was not. No, I literally distinguished between the different groups of people that are there, and there's a difference. You
posited that if we take literally what you just said, and I don't want to fight you about it, because my main message on this is I want this platform to try to bring the country together around this issue. But I'm just saying what you did is going to inflame people on the left. I believe, I say respectfully, you posited, if I take literally what you said, you seem to be positing two groups: people who committed violence against law enforcement and people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time.
I did. I stand by that.
There are obviously people, I know of cases, there are people who are not in that category. There are people who plotted to invade the Capitol, who didn't commit violence against law enforcement. That's a third category. And those people got pardons.
I mean, look, whether or not there are those who harmed police officers and harmed property. Like, it's not just any old place. It's the United States Capitol on the day they were certifying the election. The intent was to stop the certification of the election.
Okay, so this argument goes on and on. So I don't think I need to play more of it. But here's a bloke who could not accept Donald Trump, could not vote for Donald Trump, even though he agrees with Donald Trump 90% of the time.
That's a titanic contest. I only care this New England. The thing about Marty Walsh's New England accent, Sean, is so thick, I can't understand a word he says. It's like
yes, and
it's the carpet capital of the world.
Carpet capital of the world.
Thank you. Okay. I will give you a few facts on that.
It's a great success story of assimilation.
Yes. Now, my real question, though, is this. Because of J6, I could not vote for Trump.
All right. I don't get that. All right. I don't respect that. Because of January 6th, you can't vote for Donald Trump. All right. We have massively increased the chances of war with Russia. Right. Nuclear war could end life on Earth as we know it. And we have massively increased the chances of some kind of nuclear exchange. And compared to that, January 6th simply does not rate. Right? Compared to the foreign policy mess that Joe Biden has left us with, January 6th does not rate. Compared to the immigration mess on the border, compared to the need to punish violent criminals, right? Return an increased sense of law and order, January 6th does not rate. Compared to freedom of speech, right? We have more freedom of speech now that the Republicans are in control. Donald Trump and the Republicans, for all their flaws, are clearly on the side of punishing violent criminals, and they're clearly on the side of freedom of speech. I have no sympathy for this high-minded dude who is not being fully honest here when he says he can't vote for Donald Trump because of January 6th, because he did not vote for Donald Trump in 2016 or in 2020. So he was never going to vote for Donald Trump, even if January 6th had never come along.
And this is a question for Sean. And just based on the CBS News, it said Trump extended clemency to those convicted of violent or serious crimes, including assaulting police officers and seditious conspiracy. That was what J.D. Vance was saying earlier, maybe they would exclude. I think my question is this. Just because he said he was going to do it didn't make it right. And I think my serious question is, going forward, where is a line too far? I'm for what is happening in about 90% of what I see. I don't think tariffs are right. But my question is, I think pardoning these people is different than what Biden did, because this was an assault on the country that affects everybody and affects the rule of law. And
it affects everybody. How? 99.999% of people's lives are not affected except to the extent that they have an emotional reaction to what happened on Capitol Hill. Inflation affects everybody. Increased risk of war affects everybody. Immigration policy affects everybody. Crime, out of control crime affects everybody. Restrictions on speech affect everybody. January 6th does not affect everybody. It only affected a tiny, tiny number of Americans, aside from whatever emotional reaction you have to what happened. So I have no sympathy for this point of view.
And if we say we can attack police officers and others, I just think that's wrong. And I just like.
Overall, Republicans are the least likely group to attack police officers. Overall, conservatives are the least likely group to attack police officers. Overall, Trump supporters are about the least likely group to attack police officers. It happened once. It was terrible, but it was completely out of character for Trump supporters, for Republicans. I don't empathize with this man's point of view.
To hear your comments on that.
Jim, thank you. Great. Well framed. Sean.
Yeah. Look, I will just say this. I don't want to belabor this, and I think it's a very like an hour or 2 hour discussion. I've said this before. I'll say it again. I don't support or condone in any way assaulting law enforcement officers, or frankly anyone for that matter. I've never.
A quick question to Dan. Dan, you know that men who show their teeth when they smile are gay and don't know it. You know that, don't you?
All right,
John, we're going
to leave that uncommented. I feel like I got two pieces of news I need to share.
That's not fair. No, I won't go for that. All right, I wonder what Greg Gutfeld has to say about the woke bishop.
She asked, you know what? First of all, she asked for it. She's fighting with the president of the United States. She is judging him. She feels empowered. He's in office less than 24 hours. When the country wants unity, she's pulling up the leftist progressive talking points. It's not about her in her role as a bishop.
Well, that's what she is.
It's about her. I don't care what she is. Okay. It's about her and her role as a politician, using the church and the pulpit of the church to engage in political discussion. Am I wrong, Greg?
I would never say you're wrong,
Thank you.
Judge. I agree. I think what Harold is speaking about has been the problem for our culture for a long time, which is how the spiritual realm is being exploited, gamed by people who use it to block themselves from criticism. So she uses her spiritual authority to block criticism because she's a bishop. Don't argue with a bishop. She's a bishop. And, it comes from a long history of this. She's not defending sinners.
And is another good argument against having female clergy. Right, she's not a good representative of female clergy.
Or the poor. She's not like Jesus. She's talking about behaviors. And she's cloaking these behaviors under the false guise of compassion. I mean, she's lecturing a guy who got shot about being in danger. Who is she implying that is putting these people in danger? Are there guys in MAGA hats that are mutilating healthy children, removing their genitals? No, that's her team. That's the people she's defending. Does she have any evidence that children are in danger by this new administration, the administration that is trying to rescue missing kids through this border fiasco? She may have a congregation, but she has no class. She saw an opportunity to feed her ego. She knew this was going to happen, and she rushed to the trough. On the bright side, I have to say, she didn't call him Hitler, which is good. But who knew Satan wore granny glasses and stole his haircut from John Denver just because you're spiritual, Harold, and you are? Doesn't make you smart, holy, or even good. We somehow ascribe those qualities like that, and imposters are here to exploit it. Satan isn't going to show up in red tights holding a pitchfork. It's going to show up like that. She's an imposter. She exploits compassion for terrible, terrible beliefs. There is no compassion in saying that trans kids are in danger. They're in danger by the trans ideology. And when you're talking about immigrants being in danger, is she not aware that legal immigrants overwhelmingly favor a strong border because they like rules? They like the fact that you cannot cheat. You have to stand in line. I love also how she appreciates the immigrants for all the dishes they wash. She's the hood ornament for imposter morality. And she throws her weight, the church, to defend horrible things. So there you go, Harold. Can I just say...
Okay, so I'm trying to understand the point of view of that man who said, even though he agrees with Donald Trump on 90% of things, he could never support Donald Trump. And there's a common saying, the United States is a nation of laws, but are we primarily about laws, policies, procedures, protocols, institutions, or are we primarily about people, the American people? Right? I love the United States of America, number one, because I've made this my home, right? I live here, and I feel a connection to my fellow Americans, right? I don't primarily love this country because of its democratic policies, procedures, norms, institutions, right? I don't primarily love the United States because of the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence, right? I primarily love it because I live here and my friends are here and I built a life here and I feel a connection to my fellow Americans. I am all for respecting the rule of law, but that's not the most important part of living or of citizenship, all right? Take a rule follower on the one hand who doesn't otherwise contribute to this country. That person is not as valuable as the occasional trivial rule breaker who makes enormous contributions to this country, right? U.S. is a nation of laws, but are we primarily a nation of laws? Is law what we're primarily about as Americans, or are there other considerations, right? I think that people who are still angry about January 6th, and this is a disqualifying episode for them with regard to Trump, they must believe that we are primarily, first of all, numero uno, a nation of laws, protocols, procedures, institutions. And that's the most important thing, that we follow the protocol, the procedures, the laws, the procedures, the codes, the institutions, right? I think we're primarily a people. We are an extended family, and anything that reduces social trust and social cohesion in our extended family is an assault on us. It's an assault on the nation, including the January 6th riot and the Black Lives Matter riots, as well as out-of-control immigration, judges who invalidate the referenda of the people for no legitimate constitutional reason. Think about Californians voting for Prop 187 in 1996 to deny some welfare benefits to people in the country illegally. Then the California Supreme Court makes up some constitutional reason why this referendum is unconstitutional and invalidates it. All right. Many states in the United States vowed to deny same-sex marriage. And then the U.S. Supreme Court, in its Obergefell decision, right, when was the gay marriage Obergefell decision? 2015, right, came along and just invalidated the decisions of all these states on a 5-4 basis, all right, that for the first time in human history, all right, same-sex marriage is the thing, is perfectly legitimate, is the law of the land. The U.S. Supreme Court just imposing that on the United States, to me, that damages social trust and social cohesion. Roe v. Wade, right, damages social trust and social cohesion. You took something that had different legality in different states, and then you made up a right to privacy in the Constitution that protected the right to abortion in all states. To me, that damages social trust and social cohesion even more than the January 6th riots. Restrictions on speech. So, for example, through all forms of major social media, of which I'm aware, at least 4 years ago, the conservative position on celebrating transsexual identity was against the terms of service, right? The conservative position was that this is a form of mental insanity. And saying the conservative position was against the terms of service on almost every major social media platform of which I'm aware. So suppressing legitimate free speech, right, to me, that damages cohesion. Same-sex marriage revolts me, right? Celebrating transsexual identity revolts me. Not punishing most murderers with capital punishment revolts me. Not bestowing severe, lengthy punishment on people who commit violent crime revolts me. All these things destroy social trust and social cohesion. Using lawfare against your political opponents, right? I think there was one possible legitimate prosecution of Donald Trump, and that was with regard to his sloppiness with classified documents. But many of the other prosecutions struck me as lawfare, particularly the one in New York under DA Alvin Bragg. That revolts me. It destroys social cohesion, social trust. All right, you had states trying to rule that Donald Trump could not be on the ballot in 2024. That revolts me. It destroys social trust and cohesion. Engaging in useless forever wars, such as our recent adventures in Afghanistan and Iraq, revolts me. Provoking Russia over Ukraine revolts me because it's a needless fight over something that does not affect America. So there are many things that damage social trust and social cohesion, right? Not just January 6th. Now, is democracy always good? Right? I don't know whether America needs to become more democratic. It seems to me some expressions of increased democracy would be good, while others would be bad. Now, I often hear from conservatives, oh, we're not a democracy in the United States, we're a republic. That's a difference without significance, right? There's no significant difference between a republic and a democracy. A republic is a democracy. Our republic is a democracy. Now, there is an element in right-wing thought that has some concerns about democracy, right? Fear of mob rule, fear of demagogues rallying the masses to destroy a fragile social order, right? There are many different right-wing schools of thought that have concerns, right? So to me, it's not like there's one political system that's always best in all situations. Sometimes you need a xenophobic police state, and sometimes you need a wide-open, egalitarian, super Scandinavian-style democracy. All right? We have fear of corrupt urban machine politics. We have concerns on the right about the 1960 presidential election, that maybe it was stolen in Chicago. And I think that's a reasonable fear of corrupt urban machine politics. In particular, every dominantly Roman Catholic city in this country has had massive corruption problems. Right? So there are threads in right-wing thought that have some reservations about mass democracy. And I think some of these fears about voter fraud, non-citizen voting, right, I think they're overblown. But I can see some basis for it. On the left, there was tremendous confidence that demographic change would simply deliver permanent democratic power. And it would only make sense that people on the right would have concerns about that. All right. Republicans like to portray America as a republic, not a democracy. They want to defend our system's counter-majoritarian mechanisms. So, yeah, there are threads in right-wing thought that have skepticism about democracy, and some of it's reasonably valid, right? It's not clear that just endlessly extending democracy throughout the land is always best in all circumstances. We also have in the Democratic Party very strong pro-democracy impulses, right? Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon won crushing presidential majorities, and then felt themselves hemmed in by unelected powers, chiefly bureaucrats and judges. So the right is invested in the idea that it represents the true American majority, moral, silent, and that liberalism stands for elite power, elite dominance of our institutions, anti-democratic government through rule by courts, the bureaucracy, the judges, and the Ivy League. If you are a lawyer and you are conservative, you're going to have a heck of a time getting hired in many of our major law firms. We have almost all of our institutions in America in the hands of the left. So with the moral majority under Reagan, with the crowd that reelected Richard Nixon, right, with the Tea Party, we've got this small d Democrats, right, trying to stand up boldly to liberal technocracy. And so you can understand Trump's stolen election narrative as a way of reconciling two competing tendencies within conservatism. And I'm reading from Ross Douthat's column, February 3rd, 2022. So you've got the intellectual right, skepticism, mass democracy. You've got the right wing's comfort with counter-majoritarian institutions, such as the Electoral College. We've got the populist right, small d democratic self-image. And in Trump's perspective, there's no tension here. The right-wing coalition is justified in governing from a minoritarian position because it deserves to be a true electoral majority, and it would be if only the liberal enemy was not so good at cheating. And I don't believe that the Democrats literally cheated in terms of switching votes. It's just they were more effective at making changes to electoral laws in the run-up to the 2020 election than were Republicans. Now, on one hand, the present Democratic Party is in favor of letting as many people vote as possible. But when it comes to the actual work of government, the actual decisions that determine law and policy, we've got our ruling liberalism that has considerable reservations about democracy as well. The further you go left, the more you see a desire for rule by disinterested experts. Communism is ruled by disinterested experts. Socialism is ruled by disinterested experts. The more you go left, the more the left wants rule by experts, right? And the more the left wants larger and larger parts of policy making walled off from the vagaries of public opinion and the whims of mere majority, and simply in the hands of disinterested experts who just so happen to usually be on the left. So there's one question with regard to democracy: who votes? But who decides? Right? The left is all for everyone voting, but when it comes to deciding, the left increasingly wants those decisions made by its experts, the credentialed experts, the bureaucrats and the judges and the academics, right? Who should lead pandemic decision making? Well, obviously the health experts, Anthony Fauci, and public health bureaucracies. We can't have regular people playing politics with complex scientific matters, right? Who decides what your school teaches your children? Well, obviously it should be education professionals, right? We don't want parents determining what gets taught in schools. Who decides the future of the European Union? It should be the major stakeholders in Brussels and Berlin, the people who know what they're doing, not these short-sighted voters in France or Ireland or the UK, who should make the most important U.S. foreign policy decisions. Well, you need the foreign policy establishment, the interagency process, the intelligence agencies, the permanent regional specialists in the State Department. You want the military experts, not the mere whims of an elected president. Who decides whether an upstate New York school district gets to retain the Indian as its high school mascot? Well, the state's education commissioner decided that he'd make that decision. You couldn't allow such a decision in the hands of parents or school boards. So there are considerable reservations on both the right and the left with regard to democracy.
Baby drill. Cars, all of drill, baby drill. To the very interesting fact that I think 2 minutes in, what he said was, what we have witnessed and what has basically brought me back to power is the failure of simple government administration. Like, not big, not American carnage, not our society has gotten diseased, but the people who have been running the mechanisms of government don't know what they're doing and have screwed up. And they screwed up in North Carolina. There are hurricane victims 6 months after the hurricane who haven't been properly treated. And then, of course, we have the fires in California. And I thought, man, you know what? If he's a focused person, he isn't. But if he can come to understand that his challenge is in some ways far less dramatic than everybody seems to think it is, that if he can just make things work better or play a role in things working better after this sort of 20-year period in which things seem to have stopped working, like one of our favorite long-term topics on this podcast from the 2017 Academy Awards, the wrong winner being listed, 10,000 other things. You know, it's a smaller challenge than keeping the world free and making America more prosperous than it has ever been. But it would make people feel a lot more comfortable if they could have confidence that elected officials are minimally competent, like there's a border and you enforce laws at the border. It's a smaller challenge.
Well, you want to talk about small things. We had an example today, right after his speech. Carrie Underwood was supposed to come out and sing God Bless America, and the audio accompaniment didn't work. And
she did it.
Came on for a second.
Yeah, right. She did it a cappella, and everyone joined. So it was still a nice moment.
Perfect example of
we're already fixing things.
Incompetence of the small things, though. Yeah.
We're already.
But it's a good point.
If you get Carrie Underwood, problem solved.
I mean, I do think that this shift inside to the rotunda, this rally at the
Capital One
basketball arena of, on 7th Street and all that. Actually, that seemed to have been done relatively gracefully, given the unwieldy.
So Ari Shaffir, I don't know if you heard of him. He did a series of skits. Was it Amazing Racist? What were these? The Amazing Racist. He did these the amazing racist runs a driving school for Asians, and he's back now. Those amazing racist bits came out in 2013, and now he's back with a special on Netflix where he talks about the lack of importance of staying current with the news.
For the last 5 years, I have not read or watched the news. Yeah, cool. Some of you are on board. It's never good. You don't really have to watch it. I know this is a fucking news town, but it doesn't do you anything. It's never like, here's a fun summer recipe. No, it's always like, read this article and then cut out 4 of your friends. It's always shitty. And people are like, well, you got to stay informed. I'm like, I don't think you do. Besides the weather, none of it matters to you, for real, for real. You know, they try to get you riled up, like we pull out of Afghanistan too fast. And I was like, I was never going to go there. You know, my vacation plans didn't come down between Maui and Kabul. And now, neither, I guess. Fucking whatever. I didn't start the fire, relax. But the little stuff doesn't matter. The big stuff you will find, like 9/11, you know? If you weren't watching the news, somebody would have told you. By 9/19, pretty much everybody knew. Guaranteed nobody went to downtown New York like Thanksgiving of that year. Just going like, wait, where? Where are the 2 ones? I thought the 2 ones were like right here. What happened? You know what I have to think about sometimes though? Who was the last person to find out about 9/11? Like somebody had to be camping. You know, out of cell phone service. You have no idea. Show up at your campsite on 9/9. 4 days of trout fishing. Let the world burn. What do we care? You have no idea what's being planned by the Jews who planned it. Call your friends on the ride back in. What are we doing this weekend? No way, bro. Nothing.
He's right. All right. You don't need to follow the news to be a good person. Right? You should follow the news if it interests you, if it's good for you. But if it's not serving you, then don't follow the news. All right, let's dip into Mark Halperin live.
Here to take your questions, which reminds me, if you want to ask a question, please feel free to participate in the chat. And as I said this morning, I wish the pardons had been cast more that way. So I think that makes it a little bit more understandable, tenable. But what I'd like to do tonight, this morning, I wish the pardons had been cast more that way. Oops. So I think that makes it a little bit more that's leading with and being obsessed by January 6th and only covering that. It's an important story, and we do talk about it here, and we will tonight. But I understand why conservatives say enough of January 6th. Let's move on. And as I said this morning, I wish the pardons had been cast more that way. So I think that makes it a little bit more understandable.
Yeah, that's a good point. Right. If Donald Trump had cast the pardons of let's just move on from this, that would have been a better way.
Tenable. But what I'd like to do tonight is let the conversation go where it will. If I look down at my list before me of what news has been made today, on the merits, there's the most news that's been made on January 6th, even though there's a lot of other news. My judgment as a news person is that the most interesting and important things that are going on right now relate to January 6th and the aftermath, what Republicans are saying and doing about it, and what the Democrats are doing. But again, I also understand why people are saying stop leading with January 6th. Lead with the lead. First 3 letters of news are NEW. What's new today? Well, let me tell you what's new. On the immigration front, lots of announcements from the White House about how they plan to enforce the border. Lots of discussion about the importance. Hold on, is there a Sean Hannity clip? Yeah. Please pull that, because the first Hannity clip is being played right now. So can we go to that? Can we go to Fox right now? Is that possible? Oh, there, it's already gone. We'll get the first clip, because I forgot about the Hannity interview being released at 6, which of course it was. So we'll get that in a second, see what they chose. In any event, the Lake and Riley Act passed the House today, which will be the first bill passed under this administration. Donald Trump will, of course, sign it. So that's on that. On nominations, news there. John Thune, we talked about it this morning, is in a little bit of a staring contest with the Democrats, who are delaying, using the procedural ridiculousness of the Senate, delaying the confirmation vote. So John Thune is saying, you want to delay? As he said, we can do it the hard way or the easy way. He's currently still threatening to keep the Senate in all weekend so he can have those extra days to move these nominees along. And as administrations of both parties do, he's playing the national security card and saying, in particular, it's outrageous that the Democrats are holding up the men and women who would keep us safe if they were confirmed. The Fox News Capitol Hill reporter, Chad Pergram, is an excellent reporter. He breaks a lot of news, has really good sources. He seems to be reporting, the language is, I won't say squirrely, but a little opaque. He seems to be reporting that 3 Republican senators who have not committed publicly to voting for Pete Hegseth could vote no. He says something like, watch them. That would be your old standbys, your Murkowski, your Collins, and your McConnell. And if all 3 vote no, that means every other Republican has to vote yes, and J.D. Vance has to ruin his day and his evening by going to Capitol Hill to cast the tie-breaking vote. Now, I could think of some Republican senators who might not have already committed to vote yes. The allegations made by Hegseth's ex-sister-in-law, according to Politico, has not brought anyone who was publicly yes to publicly undecided or publicly no, which could mean that there are 50 votes, which would be enough to confirm him by his chinny chin chin. But of course, there could be some 4th person. So we'll watch that. And then, as I said, there's still the issue of the other Republicans who may not have already taken a public position. On January 6th, interesting, Kamala Harris sticks her head up from Los Angeles, number 1, please, and sends a fundraising solicitation for the Democratic National Committee. Based on the traffic I see, she still seems to be one of their top producers when she signs the letter. So here you see the Harris Fight Fund, which is the way they're currently branding her fundraising solicitations. Can you take that full so people can read it at least a little bit? This is a fundraising solicitation from the DNC, and as you can see, it's about January 6th and about the pardons and how that makes it more important than ever that we have a strong Democratic Party that will stand up to President Trump, believe in the rule of law and democracy, and the infrastructure that is capable of flipping one or both branches of Congress in the next election. So interesting that she's signing this fundraising email solicitation on this topic. The House, number 3, please, announced that they were going to investigate January 6th, but a much different investigation than the Democrats did when they were in the majority. They're doing an investigation into the investigation to see how things were handled. And I suspect Speaker Pelosi will come off less well in this investigation than she did in the Adam Schiff investigation. And then finally, Speaker Johnson today, after yesterday kind of dodging the question of what he thought of the pardons by saying he hadn't seen the list yet, today spoke at some length about what he thought of it in a way that I'm sure would be pleasing to the what we like to call the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. Roll number 2, please.
Republicans have long said you guys back the blue. How do you justifiably say that when Trump just pardoned a bunch of violent January 6 rioters who attacked Capitol Police? And if those rioters come to the Capitol, will you welcome them back here?
So look, everybody can describe this however they want. The president has the pardon and commutation authority. It's his decision. And I think what was made clear all along is that peaceful protests and people who engage in that should never be punished. There was a weaponization of the Justice Department. There was a weaponization of the events, the following, the prosecutions that happened after January 6th. It was a terrible time and a terrible chapter in America's history. The president's made his decision. I don't second guess those. And yes, it's kind of my ethos, my worldview. We believe in redemption. We believe in second chances. If you would argue that those people didn't pay a heavy penalty, having been incarcerated and all of that's up to you. But the president's made a decision. We move forward. There are better days ahead of us. That's what we're excited about. We're not looking backwards. We're looking forward.
All right.
Even
Again,
as the speaker said, he's not looking backwards or looking forward. He did.
All right. Very polished answer. And again, I don't think the White House would be disappointed there. We have the Hannity bite. It's on the pardons. But it's not on the Trump pardons, it's on the Biden pardons. Let's play that.
This guy went around giving everybody pardons. And the funny thing, maybe the sad thing, is he didn't give himself a pardon. And if you look at it, it all had to do with him.
All right. That's it. That's all they played. All right. So that's at 9 o'clock tonight. We'll have full coverage, team coverage, as we like to call it, tomorrow morning on the morning meeting. All right. If you'd like to get in the conversation, please raise your electronic hand.
I know. Well, now we know each other, Steve. So, and I don't know why Mark thinks I'm very funny because I don't think I'm that funny. I think Matt's funnier than I am, but that's,
Matt does imitations, right?
Huh?
Matt does imitations,
Oh,
right?
yes. He does. The Donald Trump imitation is my favorite.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Steve, do you do imitations?
I don't do imitations, sorry.
All right. I'm incredibly fond of both of you.
I don't think I'm funny either.
Okay. You're both was on. And Christine, again, I just can't remember names. Kristen Davison. All right. Steve, Celinda, and Mercedes, Kristen. Maybe even know both of them. But they were excellent. And we're so glad to have another very smart Democrat, very smart Republican here. And Steve, I want to talk about some specifics, but I want to start with you. Celinda said very openly and definitively that Donald Trump was off to a great start. and she described in vivid, explanation why she thought, just from an analytical point of view, he was. Do you agree? And if so, how would you describe it? If not, why would you argue they're not off to a great start from their own point of view? Not in terms of their policies that you don't agree with, but just from execution, do you think they're off to a great start?
I don't agree with any of their policies so far, virtually none. But, and I think great maybe I would say good, not great. But I think they've had a pretty good start. And I think Trump, I call it the 3 A's. I think Trump has 3 things going for him. One, and had going for him, and it's why he got elected. One is authenticity. You can agree with him, you can disagree with him, but the guy radiates authenticity. And sometimes some of the things he says that you disagree with the most sort of reinforce that authenticity. You say, why would anybody say that? Well, because that's authentically what he believes. 2, he commands attention. Just constant attention. And I think, we will see over the next 4 years, does at some point that attention become, people get tired of it. But at the beginning of a presidency, this command of attention is very different than what we saw with Joe Biden, who did not command attention for a lot of reasons. 3rd, action. He takes a lot of actions. And I think that the American people want action. And sometimes as I read a lot about people's reaction to things Trump does, I think some of it is people say, I don't like exactly what he's doing, but I want to do something. And I think he's been masterful at doing that. It's sort of, I don't like everything he's doing on immigration. I don't like everything he's doing on DOGE, but I think something should happen. And I think he benefits a lot from that. So I think his authenticity, his command of attention, and his action are so far serving him pretty well. I don't know that will all, play out over months and years. And when you run up against Congress, which we can talk about, which is a complicated place that doesn't, that I could argue has problems with all 3 of those things. But so far, I think he's doing pretty good.
Mercedes, I would say drop the F and Mike. That was great, right? That was a good list.
I know. Wow, Steve, I think you and I can become best friends quickly here.
I disagree with every single thing he's doing.
I understand, but he's got the 3 A's going for him. Mercedes, I know, just because I'm psychic, that you think it's also starting well. And you used to work with President Trump in communications over there. What could they be doing better? And you don't need to be like crazy critical, but what would you like to see more of, less of?
Before I go into what I think they should be doing better, I think what's interesting to note is that, since I worked in the first administration, and I was brought in 6 months in the first term because there was so much infighting, such disorganization in that part of the administration. So they needed individuals that had worked in the White House to come in. I was brought in to develop the processes for a lot of the first term, and to watch the president and his team be able to execute the amount of work that they've done in such a short period of time. It shows you how prepared they were for a while in getting these executive orders in motion, in understanding how the rollout process would be to get this done. And I find that their goal right now is to overwhelm the system. You overwhelm it so that the press is too busy going from one story to the next, to the next, to the next. It's not even giving the press a moment to digest what's happening. With that being said, and you're seeing, to Steve's point, there is a sense of motion and action happening, which I think the American people are hungry for. It's also making sure that you're pacing yourself so you don't lose those critical moments of showing these accomplishments that you're doing. So right now it's quantity, get a lot of it done. In terms of these executive orders, and he is prioritizing the immigration issue, which for the first time in a long time in an election, immigration, just like the economy, were the 2 top issues when it came to what the American voters decided that was going to be what they were going to vote on. So watching him take action, I think, is really effective. Mark, you put me in a hard position when you asked me what we think
President
Trump.
Just a little tweak.
I got to tell you, I would probably pace it a little better so you don't lose the news cycle. So like, for example, yesterday they had this massive announcement on the biggest infrastructure in history. Okay, this is with OpenAI, with Oracle, with SoftBank. It's a Stargate initiative, bringing jobs to places like Texas. Let it breathe a little more, right? Let yourself be able to capture one of these moments where in essence, you can then really hone in a little deeper in then putting out your surrogates to talk about it, followed by making sure that then you have your echo chamber basically applauding the efforts and getting.
So one thing that's striking about high achievers, whether it's Donald Trump or Steve Jobs or John F. Kennedy, is how much energy they have. And the best book that I've read on this topic is called Interactive Ritual Chains by sociologist Rendell Collins. And it doesn't sound like an exciting book, but it has exciting insights. So he talks about people who are full of energy feel like good persons. They feel righteous about what they're doing. People with low emotional energy feel bad, right? They lack the feelings of being morally good persons that comes from enthusiastic participation in group rituals, right? People who participate in group rituals feel like good people, right? Feelings of moral solidarity generate love, right? They generate energy, right? And they generate an ethic, right? And when we participate in rituals, when we get on the same page with people, all right, we use symbols, we use our interactions, we establish what we have in common, and then we work off each other, right? It leads to the release of energy, right? When each situation, ideally, as you go through the day, you're getting energy from your interactions in that situation. And when you become the lead character, all right, you usually take from each interaction the most energy, right? If you become the attention of the group, right? If you receive undue amounts of attention, that will imbue you with tremendous energy, right? It's what makes a person charismatic, right? All these things run together. They have charisma, they get energy, they get attention, and they all build on top of each other. So you want to hang out with people who have a lot of emotional energy, and you want it to be contagious, and you want it to generate enthusiasm, which is what you see with Donald Trump or what you see with the flow of conversation at a good party. You get these positive emotional outbursts. They're short, they're temporary, but they build upon a baseline of previous emotional energy. And so you get together, you build on that previous reserve of emotional energy, and then you add to it with joy, enthusiasm, humor, right? Often generated by a leader, the person who becomes the focus of the group and who is able to build the mood from his own stores of energy. So a charismatic person is like an electric battery for group emotional expressiveness or energy, right? And we call these people charismatic, right? The people who can act as an electric battery so that you can recharge. So anger sometimes is necessary to get things done, and anger is useful when it enables you to tackle a task that you otherwise would not. And so high emotional energy can lead to aggressiveness, to taking initiative, right? People who are successful tend to take initiative, and this requires tremendous reserves of energy. And when you take initiative, all right, other people may feel dominated, but if you can get on the same page and create some sort of connection with them, they will feel recharged by your expression of energy. And then when they have more energy, it feeds into you. So you can also see this in social stratification. You've got the most energized upper class lording it over more depressed lower classes, with the moderately energized middle class in between. Right? Stratification usually works because those who dominate have energy, and those who have energy tend to dominate. Winning generals are usually the most energetic ones. The richest financiers are usually the most energetic ones. Right? The stars of the intellectual realm, the stars of live streaming are the most energetic ones. And you feel most energized when you're tuning in to someone who's filled with energy, and particularly when you sense that they get you. So you have a common foundation on what you build upon. And so energy stars are stars, right? Stars are energy stars. Stars of the worlds of science, philosophy, literature, politics are energy stars. And then there are certain postures and movements that go along with higher energy, right? There's more upward flow. So when I learn to speak nya, 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 that same place that's resonating in the top of the back of my throat, nya, 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 that resonance position in the back of my throat, I speak from that position now. It enables me to effortlessly project my voice, but it comes at a price. I have to have a lot of upward direction in my body. So it requires energy to generate that resonance point, that nya, 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 up there. Then low energy, right? You hear it in the voice, you see it in the slump posture, and you see it in movements that are shrinking, passive, hesitating, or disjointed. People high in energy are high in social confidence, right? They move more smoothly and energetically. They are more likely to move towards other people. They're more likely to take the initiative. They're more likely to develop a pattern of rhythmic coordination. Now, low emotional energy is found in movements and postures of withdrawal and low initiative, right? There's often a freezing of movement. the eyes. Solidarity is expressed in eye contact. The better live streamers are addressing the camera more often, and the less effective live streamers, they're not looking at the camera, right? You want to be up to getting highly attuned to other people if you want to tap into the possibility of generating energy, right? So you tap in, you tune into the other person, in part through your gaze, right? You'll look at the other person's face, you'll respond to what's going on with the other person, you'll notice their micro expressions. Then you don't want to stare, so you'll look away. But in moments of intense solidarity, such as a group triumph or some erotic high, right, you have a mutual gaze that is longer and more steady. People who don't have much energy, people who are not very attuned, will lower their eyes and they'll look away for prolonged periods. So high energy, high attunement, collective effervescence, right, tend towards symmetrical interactions. And you'll see the emotional energy in the eyes. You'll see it in the movement. You'll see it in the body posture. You'll hear it in the voice. You'll see the taking of initiative. You'll see the extending of oneself, making connections. So the amount of enthusiasm, confidence, and initiative that someone generates versus apathy, withdrawal, and depression. Right? You can see it in the style, not necessarily the content of a talk. So the flow of a speech, flow of a live stream is an interaction. And it also measures the amount of attunement or collective solidarity that we're all on the same page, that we're in it together. Now, high energy people do not necessarily get along well because each person will likely be used to being the center of attention. They'll be used to taking the initiative. They'll be used to dominating conversation and controlling rituals. So in politics and in religion, charismatic leaders are not usually close friends with each other. They're usually quite separate. They're probably even going to be rivals. They're each surrounded by their distinct social circles or gangs. So too with the most popular hostesses, leaders of street gangs, or ambulant jokers who are the life of the party. So in any gathering, there's room for only a limited amount of attention space. So people with the most emotional energy, right? The people who are best at charging up a gathering, people who become the emotional leader of a room, will usually choose those gatherings, right? Those circles, those social interactions in which they are most likely to be the center of attention. And they will tend to avoid gatherings where they have to share the spotlight with others of equal emotional dominance. So if you are most attracted to a church service, a political rally, an intimate conversation, it will depend upon the amount of emotional energy that you hope to encounter and build upon. So what brings you the most energy? Is it a particular live stream? Is it playing basketball with your friends? Is it work? Right? We will all tend to grow towards those interactions, those situations that consistently released the most energy. So for some people, it's religious ceremonies and rituals. For other people, it will be politics. Other people will be intellectual challenge. So Donald Trump, he has a lot of energy because he is the center of attention. Dennis Prager has had a lot of energy because he was always the center of attention. He would dominate every room that he walked in from about first grade on.
This time. So that's where you have to manage that quantity versus making sure that you don't lose the quality of these announcements. The president just broke right now the breaking story on declaring the Houthis as a terrorist organization. So again, let these breathe a little more would be my suggestion as you're in terms of making sure that you're getting the bang for your buck in these big announcements.
So that happened, what you said about Houthis. The other thing that just happened is it's being reported that the administration is demanding that if you see someone in the government violating the new DEI policy, you have to call them out. The thing you mentioned about the policy yesterday, and didn't mention it, Elon Musk apparently didn't like the announcement yesterday. He was critical of it. But whatever. Okay.
Can I just mention something on that real quick, Mark, on Elon Musk?
Yeah.
Real quick. I just want to add that on the Elon Musk issue, that is a big issue that I think we're going to keep running into, which is Elon Musk has to follow the president's lead. And if he truly is going to be part of this Doge effort, and not go after, like he's been going after OpenAI because he has a fight with OpenAI. And so that's really reflecting that Elon Musk may have a little bit of a different agenda than what President Trump is trying to push.
As I like to say, there's a reason they're going to call him a special government employee.
Special. You're so special.
Different sense of special.
Right.
All right. I want to ask you, well, first, you said you didn't like Doge. How do you know you don't like Doge? What have they done that you don't like?
Well, I think Doge is a ridiculous effort that's not going to succeed, but I do think Democrats should. We started this a long time ago with reinventing government with Al Gore. You might remember, Mark. I think we should embrace making the government more efficient. I think and making the government operate better. I think the problem is that Elon has put up these ridiculous numbers that are contrary to what Trump has said, where he said we're not going to touch the three biggest things that drive federal spending: Medicare, defense, and Social Security. So if you take the three of them off the table, the notion that you are going to have massive cuts in spending is just it's contrary to the facts. Now I know the facts don't matter sometimes anymore, but I think Democrats should frankly embrace some of this effort and say, yes, we.
Okay, that's a pompous statement. I know that the facts don't matter anymore. Facts don't tend to change people's minds. Narratives tend to change minds, but the facts that are of importance to you will depend upon your particular hero system. So I've been rereading a terrific book from 2023. It's called 18 Days in October, the Yom Kippur War and How It Created the Modern Middle East. And this book says that Lyndon Baines Johnson, right, who was president from 1963 to 1969, he did more to guarantee the security and survival of the Jewish state than any American president before or since by selling F-4 Phantom fighter jets to Israel and not demanding much in return. So after the Six-Day War in June 1967, many of the barriers that were dividing Jerusalem were removed, and Arabs and Jews were able to mingle for the first time in 19 years. And Israelis were surprised to learn that under Jordanian rule, school children receive free public education through high school. Israeli school children receive free public education only through the 10th grade. Israelis were pleased to find out how cheap things were outside of high-tariff Israel. The bargains flew off the shelves. That surprise paled in comparison to the shock that awaited the Arabs. So for years, they'd been assaulted with propaganda assuring them that Israel was a failed state on the brink of collapse. What they found instead was a consumer society of overflowing shops and cafes. For some, it was their first glimpse of a modern city. An Israeli policeman remembered seeing Arabs crowded around a traffic light, cheering each time it automatically changed from red to green. And I was in Israel in 1970, and someone close to me was with me at that time. And in comparison to the other miserable countries that we visited in the Middle East before then, this person has been a big Israel fan ever since. And in the early days, the occupation worked well because it was guided by Moshe Dayan, who at this time was the most famous Jew in the world. He followed the principle, the lighter the grip, the firmer the hold. He ordered the army to exit Arab cities and position itself in military bases outside. German TV crews were stunned to see Arabs in Israel or under control of Israel, listening to Egyptian and Jordanian radio stations because in World War II, listening to enemy radio was a crime punishable by death. As for the holy sites, Moshe Dayan, the atheist, had it down to a science: separate the two faiths and allow them to pray to God as they wish, allow them to coexist. So you had the Muslims praying the Temple Mount above, the Jews prayed at the Western Wall below. And the splendid little war that Israel fought in 1967 stood alone upon the bomb-cratered battlefields of the 20th century as perhaps the only conflict that turned a profit. The direct cost of the war was only about $1 billion and was largely paid for by foreign donations.
We are going to figure out how to make government more efficient. We're just going to do it in a way that doesn't hurt the people who voted for you.
Yeah. All right. That's excellent. So let's talk about Donald Trump for a second. And again, raise your hand if you want to get in the conversation. Bring folks in a moment. We've never had a second-term president like this. For one, he had 4 years off to think about it and plan. For two, he's rested, much more rested, and the staff's more rested because they're not slogging into year 5. They're slogging into year 1 prime. And he's not being investigated for stealing the election. Everybody's acknowledging he won. I want to talk about this notion of two things that are different about him. One is he is kind of get a chance to kind of reintroduce himself, right? Because it is a different presidency. And the other is he's not under the strain of being investigated or not having won the popular vote. So the concept is Trump happy warrior. Play the other hand he bite, please.
So my attitude to pets is much more of a black attitude than a white attitude. So for white people, it seems in general pets are a member of the family. For blacks, pets are pets. There's a distinction between pets and members of your family. So I have the black attitude there. And with regard to international politics, I guess you could say I have more of an Asian attitude, that common interests promote cooperation much more than common values. And there is a profound distinction between whether you want to base international politics on common interests or on common values. This is the former Prime Minister of Australia, Malcolm Turnbull, a squishy kind of centrist liberal type, talking with Foreign Affairs.
Your own experience doing so last time around. I know it's being read closely in a lot of capitals these days.
Oh, that's good. Well, thank you. As I said in that piece, last time Trump was elected, there were two big misapprehensions that were almost universally made. The first was that he would be different in office than he was on the campaign trail. And everyone made that mistake. Xi Jinping said to me that he thought, the administrative system would institutionalize him and the wild rhetoric on the campaign trail would not be reflected in government. Well, of course it was. And in some respects, it got even wilder. So I don't think anyone will make that mistake again. The second mistake that was widely made, and I think will be made again and is being made again, is that the way to deal with Trump is to suck up to him and just lavish him with flattery and sycophancy and so forth. And that is a major mistake, because the only people he respects are people that stand up to him. He's a classic sort of bullying, narcissistic personality. That's like saying the Pope's a Catholic. It's pretty obvious. And the reality is, if you suck up to bullies and grovel to bullies, all you'll get is more bullying. So this mistake is being made again. And I mean, in spades, the cavalcade of supplicants going to Mar-a-Lago to bend the knee and kiss the ring of Donald Trump is quite a sight to behold.
Well, I want to draw you out on that bullying and flattery point especially, but maybe it's worth just going back to this moment 8 years ago when you'd been Prime Minister about a year at that point, I believe, a little over a year.
Yeah, that's about right, yeah.
And you were preparing for Trump 1. In the piece, you are pretty unstinting in your criticism. The piece you wrote for Foreign Affairs, you talk about the, quote, powerful narcissistic self-belief, and you talked about him as an effective and relentless gaslighter, so you are certainly not pulling your punches. But as you kind of think back to what you were expecting 8 years ago and what those early interactions were like, what were your expectations and how were those confounded or not in those first interactions with Trump?
Well, look, I had never dealt with Trump in business, but I knew a lot of people that had, and I knew his type, which is the big bullying billionaire, who thinks he's got the answer to everything, filled with self-confidence. I mean, it's a type. And I'd worked with and against many people like that in my business career. So my first sort of run-in with Trump was pretty early in the piece, in fact, very early in the piece, not long after he was inaugurated. I had a call with him in which I wanted to discuss a refugee resettlement deal that I had done with Obama. When I say a deal, I actually mean a written agreement, signed agreement between the Commonwealth of Australia and the United States of America. So it wasn't a political handshake or a nod and a wink. And this was to resettle up to 1,250 unauthorized immigrants or asylum seekers who'd sought to get to Australia in the US. And in return for that, we were making similar accommodations for the Americans. So it was a bargain. Anyway, we had every indication that Trump would abide by it, including, through people like Stephen Miller and so forth. And then just before the call, Mike Pence rang my deputy, and Michael Flynn, General Flynn, rang my national security director, and they both said the president is not going to go along with it. The prime minister should not raise it. Well, naturally, I had to raise it because it was very important. And we had a huge row, which became the subject of a lot of media commentary because details of this rather, incendiary conversation was leaked. And at one point, a redacted, thankfully, transcript of it was leaked in Washington.
Can I just ask you to expand? When you say a huge row, you mentioned you had a temper tantrum.
Well, he was furious. And he said it would kill him to go along with this, and he was very aggressive about it. And I said, well, look, we have a bargain. We expect you to honor it. You're like a new CEO. You've inherited a contract you don't like, but you've still got to honor it. And Donald said, oh, you're a businessman. You must have reneged on deals in the past. And I said, no, that's not the way I roll. So it was a tough call, and he was furious and ended up with the call saying it was the worst call he'd had all day. It was worse than talking to Putin. But the important thing was he started off the call saying, no way, Jose, I'm not going to go along with this. And he ended up saying, yes, but I'm pissed off, basically. It's where he got to. But the important thing was that by having this row and standing up to him, I won his respect. And we got on very well after that. And the next meeting we had was very cordial, and we had some very constructive discussions. I was able to persuade him not to impose tariffs on Australian steel. And
so this is a very highbrow conversation. It's all about principles. It's very Anglo-Northern European. It's very morally universalist in its outlook. It's quite a contrast to the following interview, which is with one of Singapore's seasoned diplomats. But here's a little bit more from the Anglo Malcolm Turnbull.
Aluminium, and that was a very rational, transactional discussion. And look, you know, we had a lot of discussions about trade, and I was able to point out to him that America had the best deal with Australia possible. We have a free trade agreement with America. They have no tariffs, no quotas, no barriers to investment, and they have a big surplus. So that literally the US could not get a better trade deal with Australia. You literally could not improve it. And so in those circumstances, putting tariffs on our exports to the US is just completely self-defeating from America's point of view. You know, by the time I became Prime Minister, I was 60, and I was 50 when I went into Parliament. You know, I'd been a businessman, partner of Goldman Sachs and so forth. So in that sense, I had something in common with Trump, I suppose. But the bottom line is, the fundamental thing is that if you want to have a productive relationship with Trump, you need to win his respect. And you're not going to win his respect by just being another sycophant, because he's surrounded by them, right? You see, if you're a foreign leader, you can't be sacked. I mean, if you're working in the Trump White House, if you're being insufficiently solicitous, I suppose he can sack you. But if you're the leader of a foreign country, he can't do that. Although he may get Elon Musk to try to meddle in your affairs like he is meddling in the political affairs of Germany and the UK at the moment.
The model that is often held up as the way to deal with Trump as a foreign leader is Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. And the way that's talked about is that it really is about flattery and, you know, playing to Trump's ego and going and bring him golf clubs and presumably letting him win on the golf course and all of that. Do you think that's the right way of understanding the Abe approach?
I don't. No, I absolutely do not. And I like Shinzo Abe. I knew him very well, worked very well with him. I think Trump treated him pretty badly, disrespectfully often. I don't know that he got much out of Trump. He was very anxious about offending Trump. For example, when Trump pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which he said he would do in the campaign, so it came as no surprise, I believed that we should continue with it without the United States. So the key country to persuade to do that was obviously Japan, because once the US was out, Japan was the largest remaining economy, you know, among the 11 countries that were left. And Abe was very concerned that it would upset Trump or offend Trump. He was really anxious about that. And, you know, I was able to persuade him. I said, look, it's a case of out of the room, out of the deal. You know, the Americans have stepped out of it. They can't complain if we keep going with the deal. And, you know, frankly, if we keep the deal alive, and we did, it's now called the CPTPP, is up and running and has been for some years, and the UK has recently joined, that the Americans will always effectively have an option to rejoin it at some point if they want it. Whereas if we'd just done nothing for 6 months, it would have just been a pile of papers in a lawyer's office, you know, and you never could have revived it. But I'm not quite sure why people regard Abe's relationship as being successful. See, it depends what you're trying to achieve. If your political objective as a foreign leader is to have a affable, backslapping, you know, mutually complementary sort of relationship, well, I guess flattery and golf and all that stuff helps. But if you actually want to get things done, and if you want to protect your interests, then you've got to basically win his respect, and you've got to be able to stand your ground. I mean, Japan was hit with those steel tariffs, and they export a lot more steel than we do, hell of a lot more. So with great respect, I don't think there's any evidence that flattery approach. I mean, there's obviously always a degree of flattery. You know, I mean, every diplomatic relationship involves some courtesies. But if your only objective isn't, quote, not to upset Donald Trump, then that means he will do what he wants and get what he wants rather than what you want.
Another leader that's been quite interesting to watch in the last few weeks is the relatively new president of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum, who has basically kind of given back to Trump what he's given when he's kind of talked mockingly of renaming the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. She, I believe, suggested in return that the United States should be called America Mexicana, and she kind of occasionally has retorts like that. Do you see that as a reasonably smart response?
Yeah, of course it is. Yeah, I mean, and Trump can't complain about that. I mean, this is a guy who just breaks all norms of behavior. You've got to give back as good as you get from him, I think.
Obviously, headlines both in the United States and many parts of the world have been dominated by Trump's threats over Greenland and the Panama Canal and Canada in the last few weeks. There are some people who are kind of straining to see, you know, method in the madness, that there's a kind of Trump strategy at play. Do you see any validity to that? And then if you were advising the leaders of Denmark and Panama on how to both make sense of and how to respond to these kinds of threats, what would you tell them?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that these kinds of threats are hugely damaging to the United States and to the world. I mean, we are saying to Xi Jinping, you must not use force to, incorporate Taiwan into the People's Republic of China, right? And Trump's administration is full of people to whom that is a very important objective. We're saying to Putin, you have no right to try to seize Ukraine, and your invasion is wrong and illegal and criminal and all those things. If at the same time the United States president or president-elect is saying, I won't rule out using military force to seize Greenland and the Panama Canal, well, I mean, essentially what that is saying is might is right. So you're in a position where Xi Jinping can say, well, hang on, Greenland has never been part of the United States. There is no connection there. Taiwan, has been a part of China in the past. Xi Jinping would say China, the PRC, has a much more legitimate claim vis-a-vis Taiwan than the United States has vis-a-vis Greenland, let alone the Panama Canal. Shinzo Abe had a policy which we all agreed with. It was really a slogan, I guess, the free and open Indo-Pacific. That was about asserting that might should not be right. That, to quote Lee Kuan Yew, that we didn't want to live in a world where the big fish ate the little fish and the little fish the shrimps. And so we wanted to maintain the rule of law, to respect other countries' sovereignty and so forth. And that's been American policy. But how good does that look when you're threatening allies, or anyone, but let alone allies, with actions to seize parts of their territory? So it's just hugely, hugely unhelpful. I mean, there must be so many very capable, very thoughtful people who are going to serve in his administration who would be just quietly tearing their hair out about this, because it just undermines the credibility of America's case against Xi Jinping vis-a-vis Taiwan, let alone Vladimir Putin vis-a-vis Ukraine. I mean, we'll never forget.
So he thinks that America's credibility depends upon acceding to certain international norms and to liberal democratic discourse, but that doesn't constitute the basis of America's power and credibility. Right? America's power rests on its military and on its economy. Right? Those are the two bases of power. And this idea that Donald Trump is stupid, which I hear a lot, and that he can just be flattered and conned, and you just play to his ego, and then he'll do what you want. He's not an idiot. Right? It doesn't hold up to examination. But notice how Malcolm Turnbull is very much a devotee of the international world order and the importance of having common values. By comparison, right, I want to play a bit from this Singapore diplomat and analyst, and he's not into the common values nearly as much as what are our common interests, right? Where do we have things that should unite us? So here we go. Like from Singapore.
We have always dealt with the United States on the basis of common interests, not common values. And that's perhaps a more stable and a calmer way of dealing with America as it has evolved after the Cold War. Mr. Trump is probably the first truly post-Cold War American president.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, the Cold War was an existential struggle between two systems. Now, you have a formidable peer competitor in China. You have a very dangerous competitor in Russia, Putin's Russia. You have the capability or the capacity or the inclination of countries like Iran and North Korea to cause mischief. Dangerous mischief should not be underestimated. But none of them is an existential threat to America. So therefore, as I wrote, why should Americans pay any price, bear any burden to uphold international order? You have to look to yourself first after almost half a century of sacrifice from the Second World War through the Cold War. So I see Mr. Trump not as an aberration, but perhaps as a return to the norm. Big countries like the US, India, Brazil, China, they more naturally look inwards than outwards. And that has been your history if you look at American diplomatic history in the long durée. It's only episodically you engage yourself outwards. And the last kind of 50 years from 1941 to 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, was perhaps, if you look at it in the long durée, an aberration. We're now back to the norm, and we better get used to it, all of us.
So you've talked about the shift in views of China in Washington, and you knew where they were when you were Singapore's ambassador to the United Nations in the 1990s. You know how that debate has shifted in the United States. What's your assessment of the wisdom of the new consensus on China in the United States? The message from Singaporeans and others in Southeast Asia is don't make us choose between the two. But how do you see the evolution of American policy here?
Look, from 1972 to circa maybe 2010, 2011, 2012, the overall emphasis of US-China relations was on engagement. Of course, there was a competitive dimension. There were periods of tension over Taiwan, over human rights, Tibet, and so on, right? But overall, it was on engagement. That is now flipped. It is on competition. And I think this is quite natural because competition, at least the threat of conflict, these are inherent qualities of international relations. What brought the US and China together was a common concern over the Soviet Union. No Soviet Union, it was almost inevitable that it would drift back to a more competitive dynamic between two major powers, very different major powers. What we would not like to see, and nobody will join you in this in Asia, even your closest allies like Japan, South Korea, Australia, is a demonization of China. This is not a country of Fu Manchus, fiendishly clever people plotting to take over the world. They make a lot of mistakes and they are not in very good shape these days. Not just economically, but geopolitically. Who are their friends? Pakistan? Is that an asset or a liability? Cambodia? Big bloody deal. Laos? A big deal. Russia? Is an asset or a liability? The very fact you can ask these questions is an answer of sorts. Now, when we say we don't want to choose, and my own country is one of the most assiduous users of that phrase, what we mean is really that we want to choose according to our interests. And our interests may take us in different directions in different domains. If I may use Singapore as an example, right? In the military security domain, we have chosen long ago. You got to be living under a rock if you don't know that we have chosen in the direction of the West generally and the United States specifically long ago. And we're not going to change that. On the other hand, on certain political issues, the idea that certain rights are universal and therefore it gives other countries a right to interfere in our internal affairs, our general attitudes are much more aligned with China and indeed with Russia, which disconcerts our American friends sometimes. And as far as economics is concerned, international law and prudence permitting, we move in different directions. So we don't see that we need to line up all our ducks in one direction or another. What we don't want to see is you getting into a confrontation or you demonizing China. Nobody will join you. Even your best friends in Asia will not join you.
There's a fairly common view among American policymakers and observers of China that, especially in Southeast Asia, but in kind of Indo-Pacific more broadly, China's really seeking to displace U.S. power and establish its own sphere of influence, its own primacy or hegemony. I imagine you think that analysis is wrong. Is that fair?
No, I think that is China's goal. But I think it will fail. In fact, it has already failed. You just look at the vast swath of countries from Northeast Asia down through Southeast Asia into the South Asia. Japan and Korea, they are never going to submit to China. Both Koreas, by the way, North and South. Because a large part of Japanese identity and Korean identity is not being Chinese. Go down to Southeast Asia, Vietnam, a large part of Vietnamese identity is not being Chinese. Indonesia is a huge country, an ancient country. It will never submit to any other country. It's not going to be subordinate to any other country. You go India is as ancient and as vast, a larger country population-wise nowadays than China. It's never going to submit. There are only very few countries that are completely beholden to China, maybe Pakistan.
This guy's just spitting truth bombs. All right, common interests rather than common values are much more secure basis for cooperation. And national identity is in large part that we are not them. Much of New Zealand identity is we are not Australians. Much of Australian identity is we are not British and we are not Americans. Much of American identity is we are not Mexicans, we are not Canadian. Much of Canadian identity is we are not America. Much of Mexican identity is we are not America. So the easiest way to bond with someone is on the basis of your sheer contempt and hatred for some other party. But that's what generates the enthusiasm for nationalism, right? English nationalists rejoice that they are not French. French nationalists rejoice that they are not English. German nationalists rejoice that they are not Russian, not French, not British, right? And so we are not them, that other country next to us. So most countries tend to hate the country that's closest to them and have great relations with other countries on the other side of the world. In part, it's the tyranny of small differences. And no country likes to be told how to conduct its internal affairs. Parents don't like to be told how to raise their kids. You don't like to be told how you should run your life. I had some real talk here from this Singapore diplomat.
Pakistan, I mentioned, Laos, Cambodia, even Cambodia is hedging. And are these consequential countries? So China has that ambition, that's for sure, I think. It has imagined a role it played maybe in the Ming Dynasty, which was much more ritual than reality. And it wants to recreate that kind of heritage.
Yeah, and so it's not just the United States, and it's not just Jews who imagine themselves as playing some divine role in the universe. All right, China believes it, Japan believes it. All right, China believes it's the center of the earth. Japan believes that the sun rises first on Japan and then goes to the rest of the world. All right, so all sorts of powers, not just the United States, have these grandiose visions for themselves, and you can hear the, I don't know, just the good-humored skepticism of China from this guy, recognizing that China tends to have horrible relations with the countries around it. Right? One of America's biggest strengths is its alliances. Now, not every alliance serves America. We may well have reached the point where NATO does not serve it, but our close relationship with Australia and Japan and United Kingdom and India against China definitely serves America. China has almost no allies in the world, North Korea and Pakistan.
Hierarchy, but it has already failed. It cannot succeed.
So let me turn to one of the core arguments of the new piece, which is really that Southeast Asia, especially, and Asia more broadly, have been dealing with the kind of transactionalism that characterizes the Trump foreign policy for some time and have learned how to navigate it. You know, you write, to quote you, Asian countries are more accustomed to Trump's transactionalism, and their experience holds important lessons for other U.S. partners and allies as they adjust to Washington's recalibration of the way it works with the world.
Whoa. Some real talk there. Asian countries are much more comfortable with Trump's transactionalism. Trump is popular in the global south. He's fairly popular in Latin America. He's fairly popular in Singapore. He's fairly popular in the Northeast. All right. It's really only Europe and European countries such as Australia and New Zealand where Trump is unpopular, and Canada. In the rest of the world, he's fairly popular because people respect and they have empathy for, and they consider a transactional relationship between countries just makes more sense. And when he talks about Asians being pragmatic and transactional, it's not just in international affairs, right? You may well see this same behavior, right, on an individual basis. Different groups have different gifts, and many Asians have a gift for pragmatism.
As you look at the Asian experience, what is the secret to that success, such as it is, and what are the lessons that you think other players, they navigate this upcoming Trump administration, should bring to their own foreign policies?
I think Europe will have the most difficulty because Europe has deluded itself that its relationship with the US is based on common values. That commonality is much more in the European mind than in American minds. And they are going to have a big problem. I think Mr. Trump is not wrong that Europe has been a free rider as far as security is concerned.
And Kip has a point. 63% of the world's population is in Asia. How did 40 keep Australia pure with most of humanity so near? So there is a yellow peril, instinctive fear in Australia for a century now. All right, a great fear that they will be invaded by the more populous Asian countries. And that was much of the impetus for the White Australia policy. Now, Australia's population is about 85% Caucasian and about 13% Asian. So it used to be you had to be white to become a citizen of Australia. That policy began to diminish in the 1960s and finally done away with in the early 1970s.
For a very long time. And it's about time they woke up, and they have woken up thanks to Mr. Putin. Asia has always been, shall we say, transactional in its dealing with America. We need America. America is a vital part of any balance of power in Asia. Without America, there is no balance of power, and we don't expect you to do this as a favor to us. You're doing it in your own interest. And therefore, when we will calculate the balance of cost and benefit in any particular issue.
I think this is a good basis for friendships, relationships, and marriages, right? You should be paying attention to the other party, making sure that their needs are getting met as well.
And if the balance comes out right, we'll do it. If it comes out wrong,
and if you make divorce illegal, all right, you're telling people that you're shackled to each other, even if the other party doesn't choose to live up to his commitments, right? People who can't be fired don't tend to perform as well as people who can be fired. So that's one moral, pragmatic argument for the possibility of divorce.
We won't do it. And most times it comes out right. Comes out right meaning on the side of America, because there is no substitute. It's indispensable as far as maintaining a balance of power vis-a-vis China. There is no combination of Asian powers that can balance China without America in that equation. That's the hard fact, and I think all of us know it, even those that pretend to be non-aligned.
To go to some of the risks of...
And there's a very sad story in the 1960s when two Asians named Wong wanted to immigrate to Australia. And Australia's Labour Party, meaning the left-wing Labour Party Minister for Immigration, he said, two Wongs don't make a white. Sad.
Of a second Trump administration that you get to in the piece. I mean, one of them is a real sharpening or intensification of U.S.-China competition to the point where the ability to hedge in the way that many of these powers have and the way Singapore has would become more challenging. Lay out that scenario. What would be a kind of worrying escalation in U.S.-China competition that might complicate it, and what would that mean for Southeast Asia and Asia more broadly?
There are two extreme scenarios which are bad for all of Asia, not just Singapore. One is if there is a U.S.-China condominium, if there is some kind of a spheres of influence deal. I don't think that's very probable. In fact, it's completely unlikely, but that would be one very bad scenario. Because in that kind of scenario, you have no agency. You have no room to move whatsoever. The other scenario is, of course, conflict, war. Again, you have no room to move if there's a war. That is also not very likely because of the nuclear factor. Nuclear deterrence does work. It kept the peace between the US and the Soviet Union for 40 years. And it's still keeping the peace. And I think it will keep the peace between the US and China. But between the extreme of war and extreme of condominium, there's a whole range of scenarios. And I think where things could get out of hand, the most likely flashpoint is actually Taiwan. We must not forget that the cross-strait relations has two sides. And I am right now a little bit more worried about the Taiwan side. I see a great sense of entitlement. You've got to defend us. You must defend us because we are the only Chinese democracy in the world. And to
That's a great point. There is a tremendous sense of entitlement on the part of Taiwan. They can't be bothered to effectively make the sacrifices necessary to defend themselves. And so they simply feel entitled to the United States coming to their defense. I hope Donald Trump wakes them up from this sense of entitlement, because if the United States goes to war to protect Taiwan, it will cost America hundreds of billions of dollars. And the bloody Taiwanese, they can't be bothered to get it together to defend themselves. So as long as Taiwan is unwilling to make the sacrifices necessary to defend themselves, I don't think the United States should risk it.
Good, we have chips. Now, that's a very dangerous frame of mind, in the context of Taiwanese domestic politics. The danger of Taiwan is it lies at the intersection of three sets of domestic politics: Chinese domestic politics, Taiwanese, and American domestic politics. And that can get quite hairy. So I think if Mr. Trump brings a bucket of cold water on this sense of entitlement to Taiwan, it's all to the good, They should get real.
Let me go to one of the other risks that you lay out in the piece, which is trade, is tariffs, which is, of course, very central to Trump's view of the world. So much of Singapore's success and so much of what you talked about in talking about that orientation, strategic orientation of Singapore earlier, was about trade and about economic access. Trump already has disrupted key elements of the global trading system, global economic system. He very well may further disrupt them in a second term. What are the risks there, and what would a major trade war, a major escalation of tariffs mean for Asia more broadly and for Singapore specifically?
Generally speaking, I think the world economy is in a fragile state. Now, I don't think globalization can be reversed. It will become patchy, it will slow down. It has already become patchy, it has already slowed down, but I don't think it can be reversed. The danger is twofold, I think. One I wrote about in that article is that I think it can push China, which is facing deep structural problems anyway, into a vicious cycle of slow growth. And that will frustrate China, and what a frustrated China will do, is anybody's guess. But in Southeast Asia, the three countries that have huge trade surpluses with the US and therefore are in the sights are Vietnam, Malaysia.
So when I was in the midst of chronic fatigue syndrome about a year in, I thought maybe a change of scenery will help my health. So I returned home to Australia. I was staying with my sister in Brisbane, and I was so weak I'd have headaches. I just couldn't do much. So I just kind of sit in the park much of the day. And I struck up a conversation one day with two blokes in the park, right? One was an Aussie and one was an exchange student from China who was doing a PhD in musicology. And I was having a good conversation, and I was staying with my sister who had a flat just right next to the park. So I invite these blokes back to the flat, and I'm entertaining them, and I start making jokes about Sheilas, and they say, "Oh, that doesn't apply to us. We're gay." So I was like, "Oh, whoops!" But I developed a nice friendship with this gay Chinese foreign student doing his PhD in musicology from the University of Queensland, and we even kept up a brief correspondence after I returned home to America. And he said to me, "I hope one day when I'm browsing in a bookstore, right, I'll come across a book written by you." And next time I was in Australia was year 2000. It was April, and my niece was walking past a Sydney bookstore, and there was one of my books, like right up front, right against the window. Right, it was my book, History of X, 100 Years of Sex in Film. Like there it was. My book was featured in this Brisbane bookstore.
And Thailand. No.
So yeah, I don't know. What happens to you when you shout up blokes at the park? Do they turn out to be gay? I hope you're not too homophobic to ignore the possibility of genuine comradeship.
Vietnam is a kind of separate case, but Malaysia and Thailand are teetering on the brink, in my assessment, of falling into a middle income trap. Nothing to do with Trump, by the way, it's their own domestic reasons. But if there is a huge push against them because of their large surpluses, and those surpluses are very largely China backdooring through Malaysia and Thailand to export to the US, similar to Mexico, for example, it is what Mexico has been accused of. That may push them into the middle income trap. Now, what that means for the intra-Southeast Asian politics is anybody's guess, but it is not going to be a positive for sure. So the two worries is China gets locked into a vicious cycle of slow growth, which is going to face anyway, and in Southeast Asia, in our neighbors, get pushed into a middle income trap. And what does that mean for domestic politics, and what does that mean for Southeast Asian politics? That's my concern. And generally speaking, of course, I think the world economy is in a pretty fragile state. The big drivers of the world economy, China is not in good shape. Europe.
So another shocking interaction I had, it was a Sunday afternoon, and I was going for a walk in Auburn, California, kind of in a remote area. Actually, I was walking up to Lover's Lane, where couples would go hang out and have sex. They're always discarded condoms on Lover's Lane. And as I was just turning into Lover's Lane, this bloke's in a car, and he calls out to me from inside his car, "You wouldn't be interested in a blowjob, would you?" It's like, oh, God. And the other shocking interaction of that kind I had was on the day that Ronald Reagan was shot, and we were released from school a little early, and it was like a 2-hour bus ride to school and a 2-hour bus ride from school. That was 9th grade, Forest Lake Christian School. So I get off the bus and I'm walking home. So it's a 2-hour bus ride home, and then it's about a 2-mile walk home. And I'm walking down the road, and I walk past a car, and I'm just glancing in, and there's a guy tossing himself, like whacking off in the car, just parked right on the side of the road. Here I am, innocent Seventh-day Adventist boy. It's like shocking. I'd never seen a dude masturbate before. In fact, it's the only time I've seen that in my life, and it was shocking. And then I keep walking, and then he drives up to me and asks me if I want to ride. I was like, "No, thank you." And then, thank God, some friends came along and said, "Hey, you want to ride?" And I just piled in the bus with them. Other shocking episode, I was writing the morning news at Cahill Radio in Sacramento from like age 19 to 21. I came in one morning at about 5:30, and the morning news anchor that week, he turned to me and he said, he looked very disconsolate, and I think the head of the station was suddenly there, and I felt the vibe, something was wrong. He turned to me and said, "Luke, do you know what alcoholism is?" And I didn't really have much experience with alcoholism because I grew up Seventh-day Adventist. We didn't drink. But I got to anchor the morning news, and I was a good fit with the morning host because I like sports, so we could talk sports. I did the news. That was fun. But one of the first times that I ever encountered like the disabling effects of alcoholism. So apparently he'd been up drinking all night, and then he got fired. But the station manager was very kind and saw to it that he got into a rehab paid by the station's health insurance. So I was about 20 years of age when that happened.
Europe is not in good shape. The only big economy that is in good shape is the US, actually. And frankly, all the things that Mr. Trump says he wants to do, and of course we have to take that with a certain pinch of salt, tariffs, immigration, US dollar, and so on, is all inflationary. So that's a big uncertainty. But he has kind of backpedaled on some of these things already, begun to anyway. So I think he's not crazy. In fact, he's quite smart, not academically smart, but I think he's not crazy. So anyway, look, 4 years is not a long time.
Let me go to a couple of other central issues in American foreign policy that you touched on in the piece, and to get your sense of what Trump moves in these areas might mean.
Wow, this looks good on Fox News right now. Let me back up here. I want to see more of this. Okay, here we go. The woke bishop.
The last person to leave that building because I was so offended about how she used her platform.
Did she come up afterward and shake their hands? Like, how did that go down? I didn't see any of the aftermath of that.
She was so arrogant. The way she didn't even acknowledge the president of the United States of America. She had an opportunity to minister the gospel. Instead of that, she is a heretic. She should never be allowed to preach the message of Jesus in her life because she's not even talking about Jesus.
This is why no one's going to these. Yeah, this is why these denominations are dying. Sadly, it's a beautiful cathedral, but it becomes just another long and hard to endure hour of one of our other cable competitors, and it's not what people are looking for. Now, in Arkansas this weekend, Pastor, religious leaders met for a service they called Resistance Sunday. So it's not just limited to the Bishop Bud. Watch.
Resist, and I pray with all of my heart that if he enacts these evil policies, may God damn Donald Trump, and may God damn all of us if we don't do anything about it.
I don't know who this is. He's like trying for the Reverend Wright Award of the week. I don't know who that individual is. But do any of these so-called church leaders represent, in your view, the gospel?
Well, it's not biblical. There's nothing in the Bible that teaches that we should speak against our leaders. We should be praying for them. We should be interceding for them. The Bible says.
So I went to UCLA a month early because I wanted to see a doctor in Southern California. So I was living with my parents at the time in Northern California, in Newcastle, 95658. And so it was a Monday afternoon, and I put all my stuff in my 1968 Volkswagen Bug. So it was, I think, middle of August of 1988. So I was 22 years of age, and for the first time that I remember in my life, I tell my father, "I love you," as I'm preparing to drive away. And he says, "The feeling's mutual." He goes, he's very stiff, kind of waves goodbye. But I could tell it was an emotional experience for him. So I drive down the 5 and I take a rest break. Oh, and as I'm driving down, I hear the guy who was fired for being an alcoholic. Like, he'd landed at another radio station. So he landed at a public radio station. So I was listening to him deliver the news on my drive down to Los Angeles. And then I pull off, I think, before the Grapevine for a rest break. And I start talking to these immigrant Latino laborers. And they tell me that I should come see them at their place in South Central, and they promised me that we could watch Pornografia together. Okay. What the hell? Come on, 40.
Mean for Asia more broadly and for U.S. presence and U.S. leadership. The first of these is Ukraine. This is another place where Trump seems to be backpedaling a bit on the pledge to end the war in 24 hours. I think it's now a few months, and we'll see if that slips further. You've been, in both in the most recent piece and in other pieces you've written for us, you've kind of stressed that we shouldn't overstate the significance of the war in Ukraine for dynamics in Asia. That's, true above all.
I do not like water sports. I thought I'd made that very clear. God forbid
it comes to what lesson China takes from it when it comes to Taiwan. But you've generally kind of seen this as a case of Western myopia when it comes to the fixation on the global implications of the war in Ukraine. Can you lay out that argument? And if you imagine, a kind of Trump reduction in support for Ukraine, which is, one possible scenario, what do you think the implications of that when it comes to China and global dynamics around some of these security questions would be?
Well, if I was sitting in Beijing, I would take two lessons from Ukraine. First lesson is the West is not as effete as I thought. Okay, and I hope they took the lesson. A corollary of that first lesson, West not being as effete as I thought, that Russia is not as great as I thought either. I don't think the PLA is prepared to adopt the kind of really horrifically costly, in terms of blood and material, tactics the Russian army has adopted in Ukraine. In fact,
okay, if you want to really see what resistance looks like, guys.
We want to pay homage to the memory of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And we had actually, as fortuitous as it was, decided that our Haftarah was going to be one that we pre-recorded. And so in a moment, you're going to see the link to go find it online. And if you want to watch the traditional version of our Haftarah, you can, of course, go there rather than what we are about to do now. But what we are about to do is pay homage to a person that was a modern-day prophet. The goal of the Haftarah isn't just to add an extra section from Bible in. It is also, more than anything else, to acknowledge that there are people 2,000, 3,000 years ago who were speaking out for justice. And we are blessed to have prophets in our world today. Prophets like Martin Luther King, prophets like Gandhi, and yes, prophets like Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I know many of you feel broken over her death, for what she stood for what she did. And so the best way that we can honor her memory is to use her words. And so in a moment, we are going to chant the blessing before the Haftarah, page 247.
So the Haftarah is the reading from the prophets that occurs on Sabbath mornings in synagogue.
And then I'll invite you to listen. As in the traditional melody of the Haftarah, we read a few key teachings, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's own words, as a way to bring out her memory and to pay homage to her. I hope you'll take these into your heart and use them for inspiration as each of you seek to make this world a better place.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar b'nvi'im tovim v'ratza v'divreihem han'e'emarim be'emet Baruch atah Adonai habocher b'torah ובמשה עבדו, ובישראל עמו, ובנביאי האמת והצדק.
I tell our students, if you are going to be a lawyer and just practice your profession, you have a skill very much like a plumber. But if you want to be a true professional, you will do something outside yourself, something that makes life a little better for people less fortunate than you.
Real change, enduring change, happens one step at a time. Fight for the things that you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you.
Women belong in all places where decisions are made. It shouldn't be that women are the exemption. So now the perception is, yes, women are here to stay. And when I'm sometimes asked, when will there be enough women on the Supreme Court? And I say, when there are 9, people are shocked. But there'd been 9 men, and nobody's ever raised a question about that.
I ask no favor for my sex, All I ask of our brethren is that they take their feet off our necks. Women will have achieved true equality when men share with them the responsibility of bringing up the next generation.
The greatest menace to freedom is an inert people. That public discussion is a political duty, and that this should be a fundamental principle of American government. Yet, what greater defeat could we suffer than to come to resemble the forces we oppose in their disrespect for human dignity?
Dissent speak to a future age. It's not simply to say, my colleagues are wrong and I would do it this way. But the greatest dissents do become court opinions, and gradually over time their views become the dominant view. So that's the dissenters' hope that they are writing not for today, but for tomorrow.
Wow, that was amazing. From a Southern California Temple near Tamid. If you want more of where that came from, definitely check out Temple near Tamid. So, the dispatch, the anti-Trump, never Trump dispatch. Should you go to law school? David French. Talking here with Sarah Isker and two special guests, Joe Alicia, Director of the Center for the Constitution and the Catholic Intellectual Tradition, and Trevor McFadden, United States District Court Judge for the District of Columbia.
So, of course, you'd be reading the text of the Constitution, and, right, you would probably want to go into the history of how you got to those words, right? They didn't come out of nowhere. James Madison wasn't that original. So it might confuse them to why what you're saying is special.
Well, I think that in a lot of constitutional law courses, the text plays very little role in the instruction of constitutional law. And that's because so much of current Supreme Court doctrine departs from the text in significant ways, or doesn't engage with the text in an extensive way in the opinions themselves. And because a lot of professors want to teach current doctrine, as I do as well, obviously, the text kind of recedes into the background. But I think it's important to bring the text into the foreground as we're talking about these cases, so that you're not just learning current doctrine, but you're also learning how has current doctrine potentially departed from the text, how might it realign with the text by this court in future years, so that you know where doctrine might be moving and not just where it is currently.
Yeah, so maybe current law schools tend to do precedent history text.
Right. I think that's basically right. Yeah.
Elliott Blatt, what's going on, man?
Oh, I'm going to blow my head off. What is that? Is that iambic pentameter or?
It's trope. It's the particular. It's called trope. It's the particular rhythm that you chant Torah text to.
Wow.
Good stuff.
That's a bit hard to take. It's pretty hard to take, my dude. I'm sorry.
Oh man.
Oh well. Sorry, I'm driving. So. I love these pardons, bro. This is some of the happiest news I've gotten.
Which Joe Biden pardoning his family?
No, that was disgusting and pornographic, and there's got to be some people on the left that are just crestfallen. They should feel about that the way I feel about that stupid meme coin I really wish Trump hadn't done that. It really makes me hard. It makes it hard to be a Trump tard, bro. I'm doing my best, but stunts like that really just depress me.
Yeah, well,
What do you think?
everyone's a mixed bag. It's important to remember that. And we support Trump for this or that, and we think he's an idiot for other things.
Yeah, sure enough. But that does he really need it? I hate all of these billionaires, and all they can think about doing is just adding to their stack, right? I don't really get a sense of a real commitment to the country as a whole. There's I mean, I hate to sound like a leftist here, but the country needs things done. Real things need to happen, and stupid meme coins, and it's depressing, bro.
AI is the future, bro. We're gonna dominate AI. There was a partnership, $500 billion.
Absolutely disgusting, and you should short SoftBank. Didn't they already lose a giant stack of money once? SoftBank. You probably don't follow finance news, but
yeah, I didn't know.
I think they took a gigantic loss not too long ago. It's just amazing how easily these tech people can bamboozle your average normie. Really depressing.
You want America to be number one in tech, don't you?
Yeah, tech that has any real application. I've yet to hear, apart from maybe like helping some lawyer write some boilerplate legal briefs. I've yet to hear about an actual valuable application of this AI. I tried to use AI. I had a problem. Wanted to see if AI could help me. Total nothing but a Google search. It's just a glorified Google search. This is going to be one of the biggest collapses, bubble bursts of all time, and no one's hands are going to be clean. Trump's hands are not going to be clean. Elon's hands are not going to be clean. He's becoming my least favorite person. And this Vivek doofus, I can't stand him either. Not happy. I'm not happy with this dynamic duo. Trump needs to. He's got to put the kibosh on those two as quickly as possible. What do you think?
Well, I would rather have them in our corner. I think it's good for the United States that we have the best tech in the world. It's enormous for our economy. They pay a lot of taxes, so I think it's a good thing that the big tech CEOs were at the inauguration. That they are trending towards the Republican Party. We want a big tent, right? We want to have the best and the brightest and the richest and the most powerful people on our side. I don't understand why you would reject that.
Because they're not doing real tech. They're not doing real things. Elon can't launch a rocket that doesn't explode. And then he dances like a buffoon every time one of his rockets explodes. Meanwhile, that's our tax money exploding, This guy's a fraud, a total charlatan. And
he's the world's richest man, and you think he's a total charlatan?
Yes, he's a charlatan, Luke. The only one of his companies that actually succeeds and makes money is Tesla. Everything else has been a colossal failure, and it's all going to catch up with him, and the lawsuits are going to be immense, bro.
And you say this on the basis of what, bro?
I've been watching a lot of Thunderfoot. He does a pretty good dissection of Elon's frauds. He's published at least 50 videos over the past 5 years, and just details the level, the depth of the scams of this guy. He is the wrong hero. And then what's worse is this Mars retardation, idiocy thing that he's dangling in front of people, and people are clapping like seals. It's hard to watch, Luke.
What's wrong with going to Mars? Where's your sense of adventure?
Okay, well, you realize there's no water on Mars, and there's no oxygen on Mars, okay? Just right out of the gate, what does that tell you? So, part 2, it takes a year in a spaceship to get to Mars, a full year. Do you know what that would do to you physiologically to be without gravity for a year?
You'd grow taller.
No, your bones would liquefy. Your bones would become super brittle. Your bones need gravity to. It's the signal that tells them to strengthen themselves. A year without gravity would turn you into a pile of mush. The health ramifications alone, and plus you'd be drinking recycled urine for a year. Doesn't that sound nice?
Well, if they do a good job with the recycling, but we've had people in space for a year and they've come back to Earth and they've gone on to healthy, happy, normal lives.
Okay, so you really think they could also get back from Mars? You realize they're going to die on Mars, right? There's no way to get back. How are you going to arrange a launch from Mars in an atmosphere with no oxygen?
It's a challenge. It's like it's a challenge.
The basic lack of scientific understanding is just so appalling. A junior high school student should be able to figure this one out. And no, they're agog. He is the master hypnotist. I got to give him that.
So I was just reading that AI is going to significantly improve worker productivity in the next few years. You don't believe that?
No. I haven't seen any benefit. I've tried to make that work. It doesn't work. It's a Google search, Luke. It's no better than a Google search. And in fact, it could make things worse because people will start to have this dumb, blind reliance on it, and they'll lose the ability to, interrogate matters for themselves and, apply some common sense. And the idea of people just blindly following AI. What if you're a real law firm and you have a lawsuit on the basis of what some AI spit out, and it's wrong? Your law firm is in jeopardy. Suddenly your law firm could be sued. This is so dumb at so many levels, and we just have to watch it unfold. It's very sad.
Well, all things being equal, don't you want the rich and powerful on the Republican side?
Sure. That's a silver lining.
Right. So I'm not someone who talks much about AI. I don't think about it much, but I've started using it a little bit in the past few weeks, and it's very useful, say, for summarizing a book or for summarizing an argument or explaining something that I don't understand. It does seem to have some application. I do see how it could improve worker productivity. Of course, if you follow anything blindly, you're going to get into trouble.
All right, but is it any different than reading an article? All it's doing, it's managed to find the best article on a subject, right? That already exists on the web. It's not doing any thinking. It's gathering. It gathers up something that it's deemed to be the best. It's basically taken the top Google search result and then reformatted it and rephrased it.
Well, I'm thinking of one application. We were getting very little information about what was going on with Dennis Prager, and so somebody put the information that we knew into Grok, and it spat out that he's most likely paralyzed. So well before that was part of any official announcement, right, Grok suggested that Dennis Prager, based on the information available, was paralyzed. I thought that was a useful application. So I'm finding some use from AI. So I'm in the middle. Go ahead.
I'm not saying it's not useful and it can't be useful here and there. I just don't think it's going to be this economic juggernaut that everyone seems to think it is going to be. When it's not. It's a cool little toy, but it's not like the internal combustion engine or railroads or nuclear power or the internet. Some of these, these are real technologies that have real impacts on the world at a very large scale. You can't get anything funded in Silicon Valley anymore if it's not doesn't have anything to do with AI. It's this magic buzzword that has hypnotized people and made them take leave of their judgment.
Well, people are spending billions of dollars on it, and presumably people don't accumulate billions of dollars by being total idiots. It doesn't mean that they're right, but I don't think people are investing billions of dollars in AI because it's stupid, right? I'm sure that there are useful economically.
Okay, all right. So take what you just said and then incorporate Sam Bankman-Fried into your answer.
Yeah, and I think Sam Bankman-Fried was onto some things. Apparently, for people who bought his debt, they were able to buy his debt at something like 20 cents to the dollar. Well, everything that he left behind is now worth far more than the 100 cents. Now it's worth like 160 cents. So Sam Bankman-Fried was onto some great things. He made some major mistakes, but he also had some serious skills.
So are people better off from having interacted with Sam Bankman-Fried or less better off?
It would depend on the situation. At certain times, they would be better off, and at other times, they would be worse off. Overall, has Sam Bankman-Fried made more contributions to the world than demerits? I'm not sure.
So
I'm fine that he's in jail.
Unjustly incarcerated?
No, I don't think he's unjustly. But incarceration and criminal conviction does not equal necessarily overall net negative for society. It's a good indicator, but I'm undecided. I am open to the possibility that he's done more good than harm. Probably, yeah, on the basis of what I know, the conventional answer would be, say, more harm than good. So I guess I'm undecided.
I only brought it up to say, I only brought the whole subject up to say because you seem to think that billionaires can't make mistakes. Sometimes billionaires get lucky, right?
No. But nothing would I say billionaires can't make mistakes. But I would say that if tens of billions of dollars are being invested in this, and that's been happening for a couple of years now, and many of my smartest friends who make their living online are considerably enthusiastic about it, I would not dismiss that, right? AI plays very little role in my life, but some of the smartest people I know are quite enthused about it.
Okay, well, I guess I have an open mind. I've been hearing about it for so long. I haven't seen the killer app yet. So like when eBay got started, it got started because there was a true innovation, which was the digital camera. And the digital camera changed the economic landscape, and it created business opportunities. And so that was an example of a technical innovation that really led to real riches and a real application that changed the lives of Americans. You can't unless you change the way people live their lives at one level or another. So,
well, Google search has changed.
To
Google search, millions of people use Google. It's synonymous with searching something on the internet, and Google search is now primarily based on AI.
Well, Google search was a sort of pro-AI, and it still is. And I don't see the incremental difference between a Google search and what people are calling AI. The only interesting thing is able to parse natural language and then bring back a relevant search result, but it's not doing any thinking. Your boy Kofnis wrote an interesting essay about AI. I'd urge you to
right. I agree. It's not thinking, but it can process data faster than I can.
Okay.
Right. It can go through 100,000 pages and give me a one-page summary much more quickly than any individual could do.
All right. So we'll take $500 billion and imagine if that money was invested in, clean nuclear power or something like that. That would have a very meaningful, large, important impact on the economy. And so to me that this $500 billion that's being invested is really being misallocated. Ultimately that 500 billion can't be invested anywhere else. And it's not like, I just don't think,
okay, I got it.
Wisely.
Yeah. Have you been following Halperin's show? He's had some 25-year-old kid there who's been making presentations about his nuclear power business to the Trump folks at Mar-a-Lago?
No, I haven't been watching Halperin. It's turning into NPR.
Oh, okay.
Though a friend of mine reached out to me and said, "Have you seen this show?" You know, and he's kind of, vaguely interested in politics, but he found Halperin's show independent of me, and he was raving about it. So that means I can't get on there and troll.
And overall, are you happy with the first 3 days of the Trump administration?
I'm ecstatic. They couldn't be better. Could not be better. It feels like he was taking, he was listening to exactly what I was saying and doing exactly what I was hoping he would do, which was blitz. This was an opportunity to blitz.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I have no complaints. Hold on, I gotta do a little Turner-Ruski.
Okay, go ahead and do your Turner-Ruski. I don't want you to hit anyone. Have you been screaming at anyone lately?
No, but I found that my nerves are a lot thinner these days. You know what I mean by that? Like
yes, you get upset more easily. You get bothered more easily.
I get bothered more. I get startled more easily.
Yeah.
And it's not good, bro. So maybe I need to do a little MJ or something. I don't know. All right, I'm parking, bro. Hold on. Oh, dear.
Okay, but take your time. I'll just play something, and you can just rejoin.
Okay. No other country would do that. And another corollary of that first lesson is that, if I was Mr. Xi Jinping, I would be looking very carefully about what my PLA generals have been telling me about my own capabilities. The first lesson is one basically of caution. The second lesson is, I better try to make myself as sanction-proof as possible. And that's very difficult because Russia is much less integrated in the world economy than China. All right, China is doing all it can to improve its relationships, economic and political, with the so-called global south. Big deal. Its most important markets are still in the global north. That's just a fact. And it's going to be very difficult for China to become more self-sufficient. Its attempts to rely more on domestic consumption, which has been going on for 20 years, much predate Mr. Trump, have not been very successful. Just as America's attempts to decouple from China have not been very successful and will not succeed. Neither will succeed. So these are the two lessons. Now, I think Ukraine, as I said, competition and therefore at least the possibility of conflict, these are inherent characteristics of international relations. And what is...
Okay, you back? We'll see. Okay, we have lost Mr. Blatt, but Christopher Rufo is probably the most... effective, doggone it, most effective political activist on the conservative side. So let's see what he has to say about DEI.
But it also means that over at the Pentagon, folks won't be hearing about this kind of nonsense anytime soon.
We currently have nearly 40% women enrolled at the Coast Guard Academy. I'm really excited about the talent and the diversity that I see.
We have to think of innovative, new ways that we can lead a diverse and inclusive, encompassing force, and that's how we can maximize our potential.
I also marched for equality. I like to think I've been defending freedom from an early age. I needed my own adventures, my own challenge. And after meeting with an Army recruiter, I found it.
Oh my God, that is painful. Joining us now, Chris Rufo, Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Chris, this is good. I'm always very skeptical. I think DEI, DO, is it really? But I don't know. What else does Trump's executive orders do?
No, this is absolutely a sea change on DEI. His executive orders on day one and day two do a couple things. One, they rescind all of Biden's executive orders entrenching DEI in the bureaucracy. But what happened last night was even more significant. His executive order actually instructs his administration to investigate corporations, schools, and universities for practicing DEI. And it says if you're practicing illegal and discriminatory DEI in the private sector and you receive federal funds, you'll be under investigation. You'll pay a huge price. This is sending shockwaves through virtually every major institution in the country. We should be always skeptical, but in this instance, Trump is the real deal. He is changing the country very, very quickly.
Yeah, I don't doubt his resolve. I doubt the resolve of some of these wokesters that are embedded in corporate America, certainly in academia. But don't you think also, Chris, some of these, especially these tech CEOs, some of them are just relieved that they don't have to do this and be engaged in this charade any longer. They do want the best of the best.
That's exactly right. I was texting with a number of tech CEOs down in Silicon Valley. They told me that the resistance against Trump is dead. That, in fact, many executives and managers at these companies are relieved. They don't have to pretend to believe in DEI and woke and, you know, tampons in the men's bathroom. One executive told me he used to collect the men's tampons at all the conferences at these Silicon Valley companies because it's so ridiculous. He doesn't have to do that anymore. The tampons are out of the men's room at Facebook and other companies. We lived through a national nightmare for 5 years. That nightmare is coming to a close, and now it's time to really make sure that that's a permanent change.
And we should remind everybody that the Justice Department's Office of Civil Rights will now be used to fight real discrimination. And Harmeet Dillon, I assume she'll get confirmed, you know, very, very easily. And she'll be leading the charge if these companies do not really good.
Okay, get a burst from Jesse.
DEI.
I said, basically, F you, cry more. I don't give a
I was floored that Joe Biden pardoned his whole family, and let me tell you why. The most charitable interpretation is the Titanic is sinking. I've got a life raft for my family, but anyone else who challenged Trump, you better swim or you're drowning.
Democrats disgusted with Joe Biden.
Well, if they weren't the crime family, why do they need pardons, right?
And this is the difference between the last administration and this administration. ICE is going to enforce the immigration law. ICE is back doing their job effective today.
Primetime gets an exclusive look into the first ICE arrests. Plus,
E-L-G-S-E-S, Eagles!
Trump's already made himself comfortable in the Oval Office. He's back to giving tours, and JD got the first one.
All right, sounds good. Thank you.
Margo?
All right, hey, Margo.
Good to see you.
Good to see you, too. Wow. This is JD Vance's first time to step into the Oval Office. Wow. It's incredible.
This is incredible. Trump reflecting on the magnitude of the moment. Listen.
Let's talk about the moment you walked back in this office, this desk, this room, your carpet. How'd you feel?
Well, it was a lot of work. And as you know, I felt that we shouldn't have had to necessarily be here. Could have been done. A lot of work could have been, it would have been over. We wouldn't have inflation. We wouldn't have had the Afghanistan disaster. We wouldn't have October 7th with Israel, where so many people were killed. And you wouldn't have a Ukraine war going on. But with all that being said, I think it's bigger. It's bigger than if it were more traditional.
Only the second time in history somebody didn't have consecutive terms.
Yeah. Well, they say it's historically bigger. I don't know about that. But I can say it showed us a couple of things. It showed us that the radical left, their philosophies and policies are horrible.
And you can catch more of 47's first Oval Office interview with Sean at 9. Trump also released the letter that Biden left him in the Resolute desk. Biden's little love letter to the dictator, wishing him all the best in the next 4 years. May God bless you and guide you. He called him Hitler, tried to throw him in prison, and now he's like, "Dear Don, all the best. Your friend Joey." What a phony. Trump's cleaning house. We're starting with a clean slate. And just like when you break up with somebody, you throw all the photos in the trash. All the lazy bureaucrats are being put back to work, 9 to 5s, 5 days a week, and in person, just like the rest of us. Imagine that. And it's leaving some bureaucrats anxious about having to go in, worried about not having a parking spot and having to sit cross-legged on the floors because their desks were downsized. And Trump put out an executive order. It's Indian style again. And if you're going back to work and you refuse, Trump says you're fired. Over at the Justice Department, agents are getting handed pink slips and being told to pack up. All the career attorneys who've been there forever are getting canned. This has never happened before. Trump just fired 4 top immigration court officials, including the chief. Oh, yeah, DEI is officially dead. As of 5 this afternoon, every federal DEI office in the country got shuttered. DEI employees woke up this morning and found out their emails are suspended, and they've been put on leave. And if any of them try to sneak back in and do undercover DEI, Trump's having his people blow the whistle. Oh, and no more rainbow flags flying over government buildings either. Trump's Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, ordering a one-flag policy at all U.S. embassies across the world. Bye-bye, DEI.
So this is about reforming the system of hiring in the federal government to ensure that merit is the lodestar of hiring decisions
as per the Supreme Court.
Other matters. Yes, sir.
Mr. President, this is a big deal. Merit. Our country is going to be based on merit again. Can you believe it?
Trump wants people hired based on merit, not skin color or sexual orientation. This taxpayer-funded poison is being eliminated, and it's saving us billions in costs, productivity, and lawsuits. Joe Biden's paid flacks are now back on their heels. After bullying you for 4 years, they've found themselves on the wrong side of history.
Do you think there should be more than 2 genders in America?
Yeah, I don't know what that executive order means. I don't know what the president declared.
It means there are 2 genders, male and female. Do you disagree with that?
How many genders are there, Harry?
Yeah,
come on, little guy. How many genders are there?
Again, these guys don't know what they're talking about, so they won't be able to.
Harry, how many genders are there?
How many genders are there, Harry?
How many
genders are there?
What's the legal? I'm gonna use Joe Biden's answers. At least 2. At least 2. That satisfies.
Well, how
the
many more other than male, female?
That's
a TikTok answer.
There's at least 2.
Yeah.
There's at least 2.
Well, no, hang on. There's male and female.
Is like human brain
Donald
rot.
Trump says there's male and female. There are 2.
Okay, Dave.
How many
Russian Rubin,
more are
on
there
now.
after male and female, Harry?
There's at least 2. Now, anyway, let me get back to
what
what I was
How
saying.
many more are there? What are the other ones?
There's at least 2.
What are the other ones?
Harry, let's try it this way. You're a female. What is the other gender?
It's so funny. It's so funny.
Tomorrow won't be a very happy DEI Thursday. But some dead-enders are picking up the Reverend's bullhorn and still trying to resist. Let's check in on Tim Walz's home state of Minnesota.
Whose house is this? Whose house is this? You chicken meatball-headed mother. Whose house is this? You listen to us, mother. You work for us. You can get
to respect my personal
space. You can have someone drag
You're
me out,
defying
and
that
then it's going to
just
be
as
on
you have
you
defied
in the
multiple laws.
In case you're wondering, his or her shirt says transsexual menace. We didn't think taking tampons out of the men's room would create such a stir, but here we are. The ladies of The View said, oh yeah, we're not DEI hires, Trump is.
Donald Trump saying things that this country would be a meritocracy. You're talking about a man who didn't become the president of the United States because of merit. He hasn't he had no political experience whatsoever. He had no business experience. He was given everything that he has. He is a legacy hire. He is, if anything, a DEI hire, a didn't earn it hire.
Only on The View is Kamala Harris, who never got a single primary vote, not a DEI hire, but Trump is. Trump campaigned hard. He survived 2 assassination attempts, beat 2 impeachments, 4 court cases, and received more votes than any other human being in American history. He earned it. But Democrats are looking for a new avenger, and they found one in a church. The woke bishop that scolded the new president yesterday on day 2 is getting wined and dined by the media. She's like Maddow, but they're treating her like she's a whistleblower. And now she's on a media tour. She went to CNN and The View.
I was looking at the president because I was speaking directly to him. I felt that he has this moment now where he feels charged and empowered to do what he feels called to do. And I wanted to say, you know, there is room for mercy.
Do you think your message is being misconstrued and politicized?
Oh, well, sure. Yeah, but I think if you read what I said, and I mean, how could it not be politicized, right? We're in a hyper political climate. That's part of the air we breathe now. And I was trying to speak a truth that I felt needed to be said.
She's lucky this didn't happen on day one when Trump was a dictator, because he'd lock her up. This wacky bishop demanded Trump show mercy to the Biden migrants who are breaking our laws and the cross-dressers who are in the ladies' locker rooms. She says they're scared and Trump should show more compassion.
I was there with President Trump, and everybody there was shocked and mortified by the disturbing comments from this bishop who chose to weaponize the pulpit. She had an opportunity to pray over the president and the vice president and their families who are sitting in the first pews, and she spoke about truth, which was very ironic because words later she spewed lies.
Would the bishop show mercy if someone showed up to her church service, cut the line at communion, guzzled the blood of Christ, flipped over the body of Christ, and then snatched all the cash from the offering plate? We can have compassion, but not at the expense of civilization. The silly bishop's mercy is what's wreaking havoc on our borders and our inner cities and in the ladies' rooms.
Okay, we'll keep an eye on Jesse's show, but there was an excerpt from Mark Halperin's show on Monday that I think is an excellent middle ground, sane perspective on Joe Biden's cognitive decline.
Finding new resolve every time a Republican takes the office. But this has been so egregious, and I have yet to hear a good reason why. The Wall Street Journal article comes out before the first debate and says chapter and verse, here are the things that we're seeing, and the media as a whole, I'm overgeneralizing, come to the defense of President Biden. And anyone a channel flipper and see Joe, the Morning Joe guy, I'm forgetting his last name, look into the camera and say, listen,
call him Morning Joe.
Morning Joe. Morning Joe. Listen, I know the man. The man is, he can run circles around you. And then he had to eat his words after that debate performance. I always had misgivings about the media, and even Mark Caputo said something about the DC press corps becoming a kingmaker. I'd love to hear more about that. I didn't quite understand all of that, but the fact is, how the heck did that happen? When will there be a reckoning? Because I want to trust the fourth estate. So I'm being a little bit more emotional than I need to. It's just very frustrating. And I haven't heard a good explanation why they fell asleep at the wheel, and when is accountability going to happen for that?
Yeah. All right, Dean. Let me answer in a moment. Couple things. Marco Rubio, right now, they're voting on his confirmation on the Senate floor. So as widely, and it will be confirmed, I'll be curious to see how many votes he gets. Joe's real name is a close friend of mine and has been for a long time. And so I always talk about Joe with the reverence and camaraderie of someone who's a close friend. The reality is that Joe Biden had lots of moments of lucidity. It's a mistake for the right. What I always said during the campaign is Biden was not as lucid as his defenders said, but he wasn't as out of it as his detractors said. And we've all, many of us have had relatives or friends who are going through mental decline, and they have, as they say, good days and bad days. And so some people like Joe had interactions with Trump with Biden when he had a good day. And so it was, and you can look at Biden events from the first and second half, maybe more the first half.
State of the Union after,
State of the Union. Okay, State of the Union is a great example. Thank you. I mean, that State of the Union where he was riffing and he was going back and forth with the Democrats, with the Republicans, that wasn't necessarily representative of all his behavior, but it wasn't wholly unrepresentative. It wasn't as good as Joe Biden was 4 years, 8 years ago, whatever. But you can't look at that. When Joe said best Biden ever, you could point to not just communication he had with Biden, but you could point to that State of the Union speech and say That's pretty good. That arguably was best Biden ever. So to make Joe and others into villains for saying, I see a lot of good in Biden, I think is a mistake. But I also think it's a mistake for the Democrats to pretend there wasn't, between the Biden officials and the Democrat and the media, the largest and most outrageous conspiracy in the history of the United States to cover up his loss of mental decline. I'm comfortable with both those realities. And I've said it many times. That conspiracy was an outrage, and the fact that even after it was exposed in the debate, it continued. They took 2 weeks. They said to get Biden off the ticket. Oh yeah, the guy's got mental decline, and then they went right back to writing stories saying about how he's outrunning his more junior staff, to the point where we've seen this round of stories that I've talked about here that, again, act like, this was just right-wing propaganda. He was fine. I'm pretty sure I understand exactly what went on. And part of what went on was collusion. And what kind of profession, what kind of profession engages in a professional, a conspiracy, which is at its core a fundamental abrogation of their core professional ethos, and lies about it, and then gets caught, and then never acknowledges it, continues to write stories. Oh, and by the way, these same organizations, and in many cases, these same people, are now covering Donald Trump.
Yes.
When you
Okay, that's a pretty even-handed perspective on media coverage of Joe Biden's mental decline. All right, Halperin was on Smerconish today, so
not utilize something we really are much things right. Never happened on a point for the presidency, end of the history of how previous presidents have used power. I have now for 14 years warned those who would underestimate Trump that he's neither dumb nor lazy. To the contrary, he has vast intelligence and a Clintonian capacity for both hard work and intellectual multitasking. This is Mark Halperin. Mark, thanks so much for being here.
Michael, good to be here. You're very nice to invite me.
The net of let's start with the whole J6 thing. I mean, there's a fire hose of information. It's hard to keep track of all that has transpired in just the last 24 or so hours. But that's getting a lot of attention, especially by his detractors. I myself think he made a terrible mistake in allowing the most violent of the J6ers to be given a clean slate. But what are the politics as you see it?
Well, it's such a complicated story. I've tried to deal with it this week on our two-way platform. We have an hour, no commercials, so full hour, and try to get people who there are tens of millions of people who think it's an outrage and a really dark moment in American history, and resent when people who aren't as bothered by it seemingly say, well, what about this? What about Black Lives Matter? What about, what Donald Trump said yesterday? What about murderers who don't get long sentences? What about the fact that some of the people were innocent bystanders? So I ask people on the right to appreciate they don't like that they want it to be judged on the merits by itself. And I ask people on the left to appreciate all the things that, for people who aren't as bothered by it or seemingly bothered by it, all the things that are mitigating and why they're mitigating for them. And to stay away from the fringe people who are just so reflexively partisan that they're going to be in their tribe no matter what, and stay away, frankly, from the crazy people who make allegations about why the pardon should occur that are just not based on fact. Try to have the conversation with people who have a genuine difference of opinion. I believe, you asked me about the politics of it, obviously very few Republicans in Congress have criticized it, but some have criticized the pardons. I think it would have been better if President Trump had cast it as like the way Gerald Ford cast the pardon for Richard Nixon. We should move on from this, and we can't move on from it until those folks are pardoned. But obviously for some people, the pardons make it not something to move on from, but to be outraged by. Obviously, in terms of just raw politics, this is one of many things that Joe Biden did that made life easier for Donald Trump, because the Biden pardons and Speaker Johnson, or I guess Senator Thune, explicitly referenced this, made it easier. So very complicated, very emotional. But the bottom line for me is, I don't know that we're going to be talking about this in a week. And I don't think, I'll be curious to see what the polling is. I'm sure there'll be some. I just don't think most Americans are super engaged on either side. But the loudest, angriest voices on the national town square, the tribal people whose livelihoods are predicated on going to the mattresses of everything, they care a lot.
I know what the polling data said before he actually did it. 60% of Republicans, 69% of Trump supporters wanted this to take place. And I think your point is well taken that as you look at the coverage of it, you don't often remember there are so many people who stood with him, stand with him now, and wanted this to be done. Here's a bigger picture question. What do you, with your spidey sense and trained eye, see in terms of the media coverage of this issue and Trump thus far? In other words, how is the media covering him? Is it different than when he left office? Is it the same? Do we not yet know?
Right. So if we're talking about the media, what I call the dominant media, New York Times, Washington Post, NBC, CBS, I think there's two big differences than 8 years ago and really for the previous 8 years. And the differences are coincidental. They're not directly correlated, but they're both there, and I think they're significant. One is they're weaker. Their market share is lower. Trump doesn't need them as much because he has podcasts and social media, etc. And the other is they're defanged. They're still hostile to Trump. They still wish Trump wasn't president. They still write coverage that's far more negative than they would if Trump were a Democrat. But they're not nearly as focused on trying to destroy his presidency as they were before. And so the coverage is softer than it was. It's not soft, and it shouldn't be. They should be covering him hard. But they're still a great foil for Trump. You saw that yesterday with Peter Alexander asking him very appropriate, hard questions during what so far is his daily running press conference with the pool.
I also saw him on the night of the inauguration as he sat behind that desk and just for very breezily for an hour was signing executive orders and interacting with a handful of journalists who were in front of him. It was a remarkable moment. And by the way, I think he was right to point out that level of access in 1 hour versus what we saw in the 4 years that preceded him.
Well, after he did that, and for those who haven't watched it, if you're a political,
it's incredible.
I don't like the phrase political junkie. If you're interested in politics, go watch it on YouTube because it's incredible. And I said after that, I think Trump's going to have taken more questions from reporters by Valentine's Day than Biden did in all of 2024. And then yesterday he took, a lot of questions again. He might have already broken the record because there were a lot of questions there. There was a lot of pepper back and forth. Again, he lied in those press conferences. He said things that were mean-spirited. He evaded questions. The question he seemed to have evaded the most was about the Diet Coke button. But he also provided a window into his thinking on a lot of things. I was extraordinarily surprised, and it takes a lot to surprise me, that on the second day of his presidency, CNN and MSNBC didn't take it live. I thought that was a journalistic mistake. But
you mean with the $500 billion big tech announcement yesterday?
Yeah.
I was working out. I was watching the Five. I admit it.
Yeah.
And I was curious, and I pulled out the remote, and I must say I was floored. It was really day one. It wasn't day two.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, I think that those organizations with tens of millions of Americans, they still haven't explained why they participated in the cover-up of the loss of Joe Biden's mental acuity decline, or why they didn't cover, the open border in a serious way. So I think for a lot of Americans, they're not as relevant as they once were, to state the obvious. But I like those organizations because they're still the only places with Freedom of Information Act requests and investigative capability and cameras, that go everywhere. I'd like those organizations to come clean about how they cover Joe Biden, both internally and externally. And then I'd like them to aggressively cover Donald Trump with credibility and fairness and toughness. But they're a long way from doing that.
What's the net of the executive orders and him coming out of the gate? I mentioned at the outset the negativity surrounding J6. Those pardons, at least to my eye, obviously some like that. I don't. But where do you think he is on balance?
Again, my favorite refrain when I appear in your program, I'm not here supporting Donald Trump or as a spokesperson for Donald Trump. I'm just a political analyst and a journalist. He's off to an incredible start. I had Celinda Lake on my two-way last night. She's one of the most respected Democratic pollsters. She's also extremely partisan in the sense that she carries no brief for Donald Trump. She doesn't like Donald Trump. She thinks Donald Trump is a malevolent force. And I asked her, how's he doing so far? She said, brilliant. He showed the power of solo executive leadership. He has shown that he brings about change. He's been decisive. He seemed on top of it. He seemed confident, and his numbers are improving. Even though people disagree with his policies, they think he's doing a good job. And I think Celinda's right. I think it's great that she, as a Democrat, she was honest enough to admit it. 4 years, this is a unique term. 4 years off, determined to do better, spent the time with his staff planning all this. We're seeing the tip of the iceberg on these executive orders in terms of how much planning is going on. They've replaced all the U.S. attorneys with their loyalists. They've replaced all the cabinet secretaries with their loyalists as they wait for the full-time people to be confirmed. There's a lot going on, not just with the executive orders that represent literally years of planning, and you're seeing the results of that. And the Democratic Party and the press are not much of a match for Trump right now.
Mark, I said yesterday the biggest contrast for me is in seeing how he hit the ground running with an idea. And it becomes so obvious how he didn't expect to win in the 2016 cycle. The Chris Christie binder went, out the window. He didn't know the people with whom he surrounded himself, my generals. He didn't know any of those people. But as I looked at all of those faces behind him in the room.
Okay, physiognomy is real. I'm just looking at Jesse Waters' show. He's got a former Obama spokesman. And you just look at this guy, right? He's from Pod Save America. And you would say, yeah, definitely on the left. So I think you can often tell at a glance whether or not someone's on the left or on the right, gay or straight.
Tunda, as he was being sworn in, they're all known quantities. He knows them. They know him. They know what they're getting into. He knows what he's getting with each of them. That's what's totally different to me.
Yeah, well, that's different. And the other thing that's different and significant you saw in the rotunda is, Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos spent 8 years trying to keep him from becoming president and send him to prison. And now they're, at honored seats at his event. So he has the press defanged, he has the Democrats discombobulated, and he has the business community on board doing stuff like the event you referenced.
Okay, Elliott Blatt, back to the show. What's going on?
All right, I'm at home now. I'm on my regular computer. Can
Beautiful.
you hear me?
I can.
I guess I got to tell my Ross Ulbricht story, right?
Yes, please. So tell people who he is, first of all.
So Ross Ulbricht is the gentleman who ran the Silk Road, which is sort of a dark web marketplace for usually illicit items, usually drugs. And he was apprehended, I think, in 2014, and then I think sentenced to life in prison or something like life in prison for his activities, specifically because the government alleged anyway that he had put a hit out on somebody because they failed to pay their drug bill or something. I forgot which. And Trump pardoned or commuted his sentence yesterday. And normally wouldn't care about such a things, but I do have like a semi-close connection to Ross Ulbricht. And so I know some details that aren't necessarily publicly known. Shall I continue, or do you have questions?
Please, go ahead. No.
Okay. So this girlfriend of mine's-ish of like 10 plus years ago was childhood friends of and family friends of Ross Ulbricht in Texas. And so she knew Ross personally. And, she was devastated by this news of his arrest and conviction. And it was like a lingering source of sadness for her, and she didn't know how to process it. And So now she was a WASP, and her way of what she decided to do, she was going to send them a greeting card, send the parents of Ross a card, a condolence card,
a sympathy card, yeah,
a sympathy card, yeah. And like me being the cheeky bastard that I am, I asked her, well, what kind of card are you going to send her? I mean, you go to Walgreens, which amazes me that if you go to Walgreens, an entire aisle is taken up to greeting cards. You never notice that? You don't go to Walgreens.
Yeah,
You're pure Amazon.
I'm Amazon, man.
Yeah. Well, you still go to a Walgreens in this internet age, and like they have an entire aisle that's taken up by greeting cards. And I can't remember the last time. The last time I sent a card was when my mother put a gun to my head, told me to send a card to my grandmother. You know, it's nothing I think of ever doing. Yet, apparently, this is like a big part of a lot of the way normal people live.
Okay, so the point is, you said to her, what kind of card do you send to parents whose kid goes to prison for?
Yeah, I said, well, I asked her, well, do they have I'm sorry your son just got sentenced to federal prison card? Which I thought was the funniest joke under the sun. And she thought it was funny as well. And so, but it was gallows humor, you know?
Yeah.
And there's something very peculiarly satisfying about gallows humor.
And did she end up sending a card? You know?
I don't think so. I think
but you should always reach out when someone's suffering like that, like the parents. You should reach out some way, somehow.
Really?
Yeah.
I guess I don't have this gene, Luke. I think most people are like me, and they just want to be left alone to process.
No. Always reach out when someone's going through something awful.
Okay. Well, and so, but nevertheless, I did think that he was, I don't think he was unjustly convicted, but I think he was unjustly sentenced. I think he was way over sentenced. And I was really shocked and surprised and happy when Trump pardoned him. Now, I don't know, you know, I mean, some of the charges, I mean, obviously, you know, I'm very anti-drug or anti-hard drug at the very least. And I don't think it's a good idea to have like this black market, a thriving black market. But I can also see his point of view, which would have been, wow, this is an interesting technical challenge. This guy's very high IQ, and he's like a, you know, a very gregarious, thoughtful, creative guy. He's not a criminal. This is the impression I've been.
And he was contributing to the American economy, unlike these AI freaks.
Yeah, exactly, dude. At least something was transacted. You know?
Right. It was like something real was going on there. Just wasn't masturbatory.
Yeah. And so he was arrested in San Francisco, and it was very big news at the time because he was arrested at the like a little branch library with his headphones on, and then apparently federal agents surrounded him and cuffed and stuff.
Did you ever use Silk Road?
No, I didn't even know it existed until he was arrested.
Oh, do you use the Tor browser? Do you know about the dark web?
No, I'm a normie, bro. At the end of the day, I'm just I'm a normie with like transgressive aspirations.
Okay.
I'm still firmly in the normie camp, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I'd tell early lovers that I was vanilla because they'd say, "What are your fantasies? What are your fantasies?" And it's like, what's wrong with a good old-fashioned blowjob and some intercourse? I mean, I don't need more than that in the first few weeks.
Yeah, you're a simple man with
simple taste. I'm vanilla. I don't use the Silk Road. I don't know anything about the dark web.
Yeah.
I'm a patriot.
Yeah. But so to the larger point, though, I just love this clemency gesture that he's sending, this signal. To me, it's like a second chance. You know, it's giving a lot of people, there's a sort of sense of renewal about it. There's a sense of
Yeah, because he's the white guy. You think, he's white, he's right. It's only because he's a white guy.
Well, right. You think about it, Ross, who really did not kill anyone, and people have gotten far more lenient sentences than Ross, and Ross did nothing wrong. Ross, there's an element of the Daniel Penny thing, is that he's a good-looking, intelligent white guy, and they decided to throw the book at them as hard as they could. And so I do think race played a secondary role in his sentencing. There's no other explanation.
Right. They wanted to show that they were tough on white people, and they looked for the white defendant that they could boast about.
Exactly. And, this woman was like as liberal as they come. And she was like part of this effort to implore Obama. This happened during Obama, when Obama was still president, to pardon him, and Obama did nothing. And I haven't talked to her yet, but I'm tempted to. But she's not going to be able to process the fact that it was Donald Trump that actually got her childhood friend out of prison. Without, like you said earlier, Trump acts. He doesn't just fill the air with flowery words. He just takes action, and there's just something intrinsically satisfying about that.
Yeah, he doesn't suffer from analysis paralysis.
Yeah. So he may have over-pardoned in the case of J6. I don't know. I don't particularly care. I'm past that. But I do respect the fact that he is capable of bold, decisive action. And I think bold, decisive action is the order of the day. And so I'm a very happy Trump-tard right now, bro.
Okay. Good to hear, bro.
Okay. Well, that was the only thing I wanted to add before my parking adventure. I hope the story was edifying.
Thank you. Talk to you later, man.
All right. Blessings. All right.
Bye-bye. Okay, so I've been reading a book. It's called The Most Powerful Court in the World, History of the Supreme Court of the United States. And there's a good anecdote early on about the most partisan Supreme Court justice of all time, Samuel Chase. So he was appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1796 after a long career as a legislator and a judge. So it used to be in the 18th and 19th century, most people who were appointed to the Supreme Court came from a background in politics. So Sandra Day O'Connor, who I believe was a state senator in Arizona, was the last Supreme Court justice who served in political office. But this guy was pretty partisan. He gave campaign speeches for John Adams. He presided over the celebrated 1799 treason trial of John Fries in such a partisan manner that Fries' defense attorneys quit in disgust. When it came to the sedition trial of pamphleteer James Callender, Chase refused to let the sole defense witness testify and chastised the defense lawyers so constantly they refused to continue. When a grand jury declined to indict a Delaware newspaper publisher for sedition, Chase refused to discharge the grand jurors until they changed their mind. So in 1804, the House of Representatives, which was more than 70% Republican, voted to impeach Chase. And Chase was from the other party, the Federalist Party, Samuel Chase. And then they voted to impeach, it went to the Senate. Chase's trial in the Senate was a sensation. Right? No event of a domestic nature since the adoption of the federal Constitution excited in the USA more universal interest than the impeachment of Judge Chase. Trial took place in early 1805. While the court was in session, because at that time the Supreme Court still shared the Capitol with Congress, so Chase would walk back and forth between the two chambers. So he was a justice in one room, a defendant in the other. The Republicans held more than 2/3 of the seats in the Senate, so a party line vote would have been enough to convict Chase, but several Republicans voted not guilty, so Chase was acquitted. And this is what I love. The trial had a sobering effect on Samuel Chase himself, who uncharacteristically stayed out of controversy for the rest of his career. It had a similar effect on the other justices, who likewise toned down the partisanship of their jury charges. The episode also had an effect on Congress, in that Samuel Chase remains the only Supreme Court justice ever to be impeached. In the 2 centuries since, members of Congress have often been displeased with the justices, but have used methods other than impeachment to try to bring them into line. All concerned seem to have recognized the chaos that would result if the majority party in Congress routinely impeached justices of the other party. Back to Michael Smerconish talking with Mark Halperin.
Yesterday, putting up billions of dollars of private sector dollars to do projects that he'll take credit for. So again, this is not going to last forever. There's lots of problems. He continues to be a flawed human being and flawed as a leader. But right now, just in pure politics, he's in as commanding a position as I've seen a new president. And he's had this unique thing. He's not a first-term president who needs to learn where the bathroom is. And he's not a second-term president who's kind of a traditional second-term president who is 5 years in with no break and is depleted and his staff is depleted and kind of without momentum. This is an experienced second-term president with much more momentum. And just to be clear, I'm not saying he came in with more momentum than anyone, other first-term presidents. It's more momentum than a second-term president has ever had in my career.
This is Mark Halperin. Mark, speak to me now about the relationship with the Hill and what's coming legislatively. We know the executive orders, but what's going to come out of the Congress?
This is the Smerconish podcast from SiriusXM.
Come on, man. Don't drop these commercials on me. I'm trying to do a serious show here.
They're super soft fleece sweatpants. That factories and coziness and get free shit with a 3. We know the executive orders, but what's going to come out of the Congress?
Well, this is where the challenge is, as everybody listening to this knows, because of the narrow majorities. He met yesterday with the Republican leadership. He made 2 recommendations to them of things they've already rejected. One, to have recess appointment power in the Senate. I don't think that's going to happen. But the other one, to go back to considering trying to raise the debt ceiling by making Democrats deal with providing votes for that if they want aid for Southern California for the fires. So there's a lot to do, and there'll be other legislation, but these big pieces, which is kind of boring for some people, of raising the debt ceiling, passing a continuing resolution or a budget, and then these reconciliation packages. The big challenge to me is some of the things Donald Trump wants to do with Capitol Hill will require at least 7 Democratic senators to vote yes. All the pieces of legislation, which is most things that require 60 votes, he's going to need to deal with Democrats. How does he do that without getting the Republicans, particularly in the House, whose attitude is, if you deal with Democrats on anything, you're a squish, you're a rhino, we don't want to deal with you. How he gets accomplishments with 60 votes while preserving the ability to get pretty much all the House Republicans and almost all the Senate Republicans to vote yes on those few important bills that require just a majority, that's to me a big challenge. We haven't seen yet how he's going to surmount that.
How long until somebody within his own party crosses him? I asked that question because of J6 being top of mind, but it seems like there's fealty like we've never seen before toward him from his own party.
Yeah. I can't think of any president who's had this much fealty of either party. It's not unanimous, but it's pretty close. You know, the notion that you can rise in the Republican Party by crossing Donald Trump now, pretty minimal. If you're connected to, for instance, to Mike Pompeo or Nikki Haley or Mike Pence, all of whom served in senior positions and Trump won, if you've ever worked with them or spoken favorably about them, chances are if you're in a position, you're going to lose it. And if you apply for a position in the administration, you're not going to get it. And so doing that, you know, I like to say Donald Trump, people say he doesn't hold grudges. He doesn't, but he does get even, right? It's not quite the same thing. So that inspires fealty. And he's got personal ties to Johnson, improved ties to Thune, and so he's his own one person, good cop, bad cop. And I think there are going to be a lot of challenges, but the level of fealty to him amongst the governors and the House and Senate amongst Republicans is very high.
Does that extend to his cabinet and senior selections, those that require Senate nomination? I'm looking at a Senate confirmation. I'm looking at a headline right now. Hegseth's former sister-in-law claims he was abusive to second wife.
So his nomination has already passed out of the Armed Services Committee. they were scheduling a floor vote. This is new information. I think it speaks to the failure of the FBI to thoroughly investigate this, because apparently this was not part of it. Not a surprise for a variety of reasons. I don't know whether this will derail it. I also don't know if the two nominees who are pending, both former Democrats who are thought to not have in hand 50 votes, Bobby Kennedy and Tulsi Gabbard, I don't know whether they'll be confirmed. The general sense is all of them will be confirmed. All of them will. But until those three have 50 votes, and none of the three have 50 public commitments, I don't think it's a sure thing. But I think they probably will get that.
I'm interested to see how the week ends, meaning Friday in particular. I think he's still scheduled to go to California. I didn't like when he made the personal comments about Gavin Newsom while the Los Angeles area was still burning, but how he comports himself if that visit comes off as scheduled, I think is going to be really interesting. What do you anticipate?
Well, it's supposed to, as I understand it, to California, New York, and Las Vegas, or somewhere in Nevada. I think this is another power he has now, is photo ops. You know, you think about just since he took office, right? The photo op of throwing the pens, the signature, signing the bill signing, doing first of all, the novel, clever thing of doing the bill signings in front of 20,000 people, right? So you turn them from a guy sitting in a stone quiet office with 8 people behind him to doing it in an arena, and then chucking the pens like T-shirts out of a cannon into the crowd. Think about him, you know, the inaugural ball doing YMCA holding a big sword, and now he's doing more photo ops. You know, I've talked about this before. Trump is a lot of things. The thing he's probably best at is the same thing I think I'm best at: television producing. He's a great television producer, and I think you're going to see that. And the Democrats, first of all, they need to cast their show. Trump thinks about life as cinematic arcs, story arcs, right? And his favorite ones are ones that he's the star of. And right now, he's back in the White House, and his story does not include a special counsel investigating whether Putin helped him win the election. It doesn't include Paul Ryan, right? It doesn't include picking Rex Tillerson and then having to fire him as Secretary of State. The current narrative arc is he's the hero of a story of success and redemption and resurrection, and he survived the shooting. And so for Trump, all these photo ops are just another scene that might make the movie. It could be on the cutting room floor, it could be in the director's cut. But those trips are, you know, why do presidents do those trips? To show, you know, they're popular. But he's not running for re-election. He's simply creating additional potential scenes for the final cut of the Donald J. Trump story.
Where can people get more of your insights? You want to reference to?
Okay, pretty disturbing story here, guys. Bloomberg has analyzed men having conversations online. The second Trump presidency, brought to you by YouTubers. Podcasters including Joe Rogan, Theo Vaughn, and Logan Paul are mobilizing America's men to lean right. An analysis of over 2,000 videos shows how. My God. Did you know about this? To hear these podcasters tell it, America is in a desperate place, destabilized by soaring inflation, migrants streaming across the border, and the beginnings of a Third World War. Gender politics have gotten out of hand while schools and the medical establishment duped the public. Same messages were communicated in Trump's inaugural address on Monday. These hosts had more politicians and pundits on their shows, discussed political issues more frequently than normal in the run-up to the election. None of the broadcasters styled themselves as political pundits. Their conservative talking points were sandwiched between freewheeling. My God, men are having freewheeling discussions online, guys. Freewheeling discussions of sports, masculinity, internet culture, gambling, and pranks, making the rhetoric more palatable to an apolitical audience. Their popularity is sparking a sea change in terms of who are the voices that matter, says Mark Zuckerberg in a conversation with Joe Rogan. There's this wholesale generational shift in who are the people being listened to. 50% of people over the age of 12 listen to a podcast monthly. Zuckerberg has loosened Meta's policies on free speech. Many of the podcasters were coveted guests at inauguration events. These podcasters have an audience that skews 80% male. Men, particularly white men, have long made up Trump's core base of support. In November's election, young men swung especially hard to the right. More than half of men under 30 supported Trump. He received more support from young men than any Republican candidate in more than 2 decades. The broadcasters described American men as victims of a Democratic campaign to strip them of their power. This is a comforting message to a dispirited audience. These days, young men are lonelier than ever, with those aged 18 to 23 the least optimistic about their future, having the lowest levels of social support. Trump and his allies showed up for young men in the places where they were already spending their time and supplied them with answers. We're in this media environment where people want to authentically know somebody. When they feel like they authentically know somebody, they feel like they can trust them more. Typical format of these shows is, my God, a long-form interview with a guest. This is scary. Men are talking to men online with very little censorship. Trump's personality and history are compatible with the program's messaging on masculinity. Don't be ashamed of your base manly desires. Don't let anyone make you feel guilty. Don't let anyone take you down. You should be strong and proud. You should also go after the people criticizing you. Did you know that hosts are using humor and vice to connect to their audiences, and that they provide a framework for male viewers on navigating the world, including their relationships with women and pop culture? They are challenging institutions. They are reinforcing old-fashioned gender roles, and they are glorifying men who appear to have fallen out with the public. Trump's often combative messaging is aligning with what succeeds on YouTube. The easiest route these days to viewership is by creating enemies. It's me against the world. I'm the little guy standing up for what's right, against the corporations, against government greed, against Chuck Schumer. If you want to find a white knight, look at me. The male-oriented podcasts tracked by Bloomberg each have their own style of show. Theo Vaughn discusses substance abuse. Lex Friedman focuses on expert opinions. Sean Ryan talks to people associated with the military. Logan Paul, the Nelk Boys, and Aiden Ross focus on humor, sports, pranks, and creative drama. These male podcasters are challenging political correctness, and they are not pushing back against their guests' ideas. They are recasting controversial content as edgy humor. Are you guys alert to what's going on? Men are talking to men online. So they are creating an effect, guys, an effect that gives viewers a sense of being inducted into a virtual close-knit friend group from home. Top guests by number of views across the network reveals the kind of content that resonates the most with the broadcaster's audience. So you've got Andrew Tate, Tucker Carlson, Elon Musk, Bobby Kennedy, J.D. Vance, Vivek Ramaswamy. As the election drew closer, more politicians and pundits were invited onto these male podcasts, showing how the channels had become explicitly tied to politics. Oh my God. On Ross's YouTube channel, Tate, far-right political pundit Nick Fuentes, and internet personality Sneeko repeated white supremacy talking points, including the notion of a great replacement. And this video garnered over 1 million views on YouTube. Right, 3 of the guests have all been banned from YouTube, but a policy loophole allows them to be interviewed as guests. Oh, this is so scary on popular channels. Then we have an interview between podcast host Patrick Bet-David and Thomas Rousseau, the founder of Patriot Front. It's a white supremacist group, and Joe Rogan's interview with Elon Musk, in which Musk spread a debunked theory of undocumented immigrant votes swaying the U.S. election. These male broadcasters are talking about voting, immigration, people identifying as transgender, institutional medicine, war, and the economy. These shows are affirming young men's sense of self and their place in the world and what their place should look like. Voting was the most frequently mentioned political topic among the highly viewed videos. My God, hosts are raising questions about elections, including casting doubt on democratic processes and on the results of the 2020 U.S. presidential vote. YouTube began to explicitly allow discussion of the big lie. the falsehood that the results of the 2020 U.S. election were due to widespread voter fraud after a controversial policy change in June 2023. These broadcasters tend to be anti-war and isolationist. They are discussing geopolitics and global conflict, and they are pontificating about the Russia-Ukraine and Israel-Hamas wars. They are speculating about foreign adversaries, including North Korea and China, and they are painting Trump as a peacemaker, pushing the idea that there were no wars when he was serving as U.S. president. Broadcasters also mention transgender identity in 3 out of 10 videos. They often portray trans people as aberrant, and these male podcasters are reinforcing ideas of a gender binary. Oh my God! Let's get some Ben Shapiro
in
here.
areas of the West. That seeing like 100x increase in trans identification in areas of the West. That doesn't wash. That doesn't wash. You've never seen anything like that. What condition, other than sort of like an actual viral contagion, what mental health condition have you seen that has increased so starkly without any sort of social contagion being a part of it? It doesn't work that way.
My God, this is so scary.
Concrete example, right? So, there's obviously this big debate about transgender issues, and you don't have to wade into that. But what really worries me is when you've got pharmaceutical companies that are making billions of dollars on hormonal therapies for kids. And are we really being smart about whether this is good for the kids, about whether it causes long-term consequences? And why is nobody saying, well, wait a second, the people who are lobbying us to give these drugs to kids are also getting rich off of it. Right. And I worry about that. I mean,
you have to follow the money motive.
Yeah, man.
Wow. Did you guys know about these scary podcasts?
People think is crazy. And biological men competing in women's sports is something most people think is crazy. And 13-year-olds getting puberty blocking hormones, 11-year-olds, all that stuff.
Whoa, there's this whole scary world online that I just didn't know about.
Guys should be allowed to punch. Is it mainstream to go out there every day and say that guys should be allowed to punch women in the face at the Olympics and pretend they're women? That's not mainstream. 70% more, really, but 70% of the Americans polled say they don't want it. They don't want men in women's sports or boys and girls sports. That's not mainstream. You and I are the mainstream. They're not.
Man, this is just reinforcing old-fashioned ideas about gender identity. Very disturbing. Whoa.
They described gender transition as life-saving medical care in order to get insurance for it.
Yeah.
Because otherwise insurance won't pay for it. So they were willing to describe it in that way to ensure that people would profit off of it, which is wild.
Wow. This is crazy. I didn't know this.
For they are actively pushing for boys who identify as girls to compete against girls in sports, changing our language so that the word woman, the identity of being a woman, is essentially being erased from our society. And it is the height of hypocrisy and, frankly, an act of hatred towards women that they are so intent on doing this. And ironic that it's coming from the party that for so long proclaimed themselves to be the greatest feminists and the most pro-woman party in the country.
Did you know that there was all this scary material online that men are just having conversations online with men? 30% of videos discussing transgender identity mention children. Hosts are criticizing public schools for simply letting children explore their gender identity. And they are all staunchly opposed to gender-affirming care for minors. Guys, according to the American Medical Association, physicians providing gender-affirming care are bound by their ethical duty to act in a patient's best interest. Clinical guidelines help them carefully consider whether care is medically necessary for improving the physical and mental health of patients. That makes me feel so much better. Wow. And the hosts talk about sports, and they argue that it is inappropriate for transgender and intersex athletes to compete And then they have vaccine skepticism, immigration, and how difficult it is to get by in today's economic climate. It's absolutely crazy that all we get from most politicians is sound bites and short clips, Gunther says, a 35-year-old independent, political independent. I thought J.D. Vance was an idiot and a weirdo based on how the internet talks about him and the few little things that we hear from the interviews or stories. And I listened to his interview, gave me a totally different perspective on the guy. And since the election, guys, these creators, these male creators talking to a mainly male audience, they have continued making videos and poisoning the American soul on these same themes. And they now have increasing leeway from the platforms on the content that used to be against the rules. And they were at the inauguration. How scary is this? Did you realize that there were men out there talking to men? And just saying things? I'm not sure they even have.
You guys are thinking like me. You're seeing what's happening in this country. Everything's just getting really, really weird. You got men playing in women's sports. The border's wide open. This election might be the most important election in U.S. history. I know you guys feel the same way. That's why we're teaming up with sendthevote.com to make sure that everybody votes. Sendthevote.com is neither left.
Oh, man. I had no idea that there was so much frightening material online. And men just talking to men. How do they allow this?
The easiest route these days to viewership is by creating enemies. Yeah. It doesn't matter who those enemies are. You just have to be creating enemies. So the easiest thing to do, the far easiest thing to do, is make an enemy out of everyone. Every single person. It's me against the world. I'm the little guy standing up for what's right. Against the corporations, against the government greed, against Chuck Schumer. If you want to find a white knight, look to me. I'm your fucking guy.
Whoa. I didn't know this kind of stuff was going on online. Is this even approved? I mean, is this stuff peer-reviewed and fact-checked? It's just like guys talking to guys, man. It's very disturbing.
To some degree, the election was rigged.
100% stolen. Are you
like
joking?
It was rigged to that large of a degree.
They completely change the way people vote right before the election on the basis of COVID, which had nothing to do.
So in that way, it was rigged, meaning
100%,
like
and then
manipulated.
Then you censor the information people are allowed to get. Anyone who complains about COVID, which is like, by the way, it might have hurt Trump, but I mean, it's like whatever. I mean, you could play it many different ways.
That is scary.
Kept us out of wars, you know, and that's arguably the most important thing right now. Like, we're on the brink of World War III madness, chaos.
You can't have Kamala Harris, bro.
Putin and Kim Jong-un in the same car together?
Kamala Harris
and no one respects the United States right now as a country. But when Donald Trump gets into the office, there's respect. They're not going to try to do shit. They're not going to try to take advantage of us, strike crazy business deals, do shady shit. I like the fact that Donald Trump's a billionaire because he doesn't need to do corrupt shit to make money. That's a good thing.
Whoa.
First-time voters watching today. You know, and I want to make it very clear to everybody that you're a human being. You're a great human being. I want you to basically talk in this camera, talk to them and explain why it's very important as a first-time voter to go out and vote and why they should vote for you.
Frightening.
He was, when there was essentially a palace coup against him, he was replaced not by any kind of election, but, you know, he is essentially his successor, Vice President Harris, was essentially chosen by an oligarchy.
Did you know that men are allowed to have these conversations online and just say these things without approval?
That's the current election. Men versus women. That's the election. Dudes for Kamala, get an AIDS test. You're you're basically a chick. You're all trans. All of you. That's the current conversation. You have the masculine against the feminine. That's all it is. In the West, we're now run by the feminine. It's a matriarchy, head to toe. It's a complete feminine mindset. And we're going to see, but I have a suspicion, that matriarchal societies cannot outcompete patriarchal societies, which is why all of history was patriarchal, because the matriarchal ones lost. And now we have a matriarchal society, the West, which is going to be competing against the patriarchal societies. And this is what's going to happen. This is why Islam is going to conquer the world. This is why white people are going to go extinct.
What I'm saying is, like, this election is the last chance to preserve democracy in America. Mark my words. Everything they accuse Trump of, they are guilty of. And if Trump doesn't win, this will be the last real election in America. And we will, if the big government Kamala puppet machine wins, they will legalize the illegals in the swing states. There will be no swing states. Every election going forward will be a guaranteed Democrat win, and it'll actually be worse than California.
Did you realize that these kind of conversations were
biological men competing in?
Stop it! Stop the misinformation! Come on, please. We got to stop the misinformation. My God, the headline: the second Trump presidency brought to you by YouTubers. Frightening what's going on. Frightening.
And I mean that for years.
All right, this is Brian McClanahan, a right-wing politician, very much states' rights.
We've had the states being subjected to invasion from foreign places due to mass immigration. This is Trump's position on immigration. He's closed the border, declared a national emergency. He's declared the cartels terrorist organizations. We're going to use the full weight of the United States military to go after this stuff. And again, if we're going to do something, if we're going to be imperialist, you might as well use it and do it the right way. And this is where I'd say this. Look, we're going to make sure that we take the Panama Canal back. We want to annex Greenland for the resources there. That's what Trump is doing. Look, he's looking at this as a strategic resource. You've got resources in Greenland that the United States wants and needs. So this is where American imperialism in the Western Hemisphere makes sense from this kind of TR, FDR, Woodrow Wilson kind of position. Now, he's not going to want to go to war with people in Europe. He's going to pursue the America First. In fact, there was an executive order, we're going to pursue America First, America's interest. And that might mean staying out of foreign wars and foreign conflicts. I mean, that could mean that. We'll see. I think a lot of people, I'm suspicious about what Trump is going to do. I'm cautiously optimistic on some things, suspicious that some of the stuff would even happen or what it's going to mean, because you've got this massive bureaucracy that Trump really can't control. But in this particular executive order, there's this line. It says this, quote, in joining the Union, the states agreed to surrender much of their sovereignty and join the Union in exchange for the federal government's promise in Article 4, Section 4 of the U.S. Constitution, quote, to protect each of the states against invasion. That's a false statement. The states never agreed to surrender much of their sovereignty. They never did that at all. In fact, that would have been news to them. They agreed to join the Union, but not to surrender their sovereignty. But you see, this is what happens when you get the West Coast Straussians writing these things. Trump didn't write any of this stuff. In fact, he's saying, okay, what's this one? Oh, yes, here it is. I'm going to sign this. Just like Biden, you've got a huge group of people behind him producing all of these things and telling them this is what we're going to do. Now, Trump, I think, more than Biden, has final say in some of this stuff. And he's probably looked at these things. But Trump is just going to do whatever his team of people tell him to do. And he's already brought Michael Anton into the fold. He's going to bring all the West Coast Straussians into the fold. And this is the kind of stuff you're going to get. This kind of fake history, right? And this is not true. The states didn't surrender any of their sovereignty. This is, again, where I would say Trump has got a few issues with how he looks at things, or at least how these things are going to be presented to the public. We have got to be careful with the West Coast Straussians in the White House from a federal republic position. And look, I said this before Trump was sworn in, when I talked about Texit, when I talked about secession, when I talked about these things. Keep preparing, keep thinking locally and acting locally, because with this kind of stuff being codified into law, we've got some issues, right? So we have to keep pushing back on these things and trying to keep educating the people that would be in some ways responsible for some of this stuff, right? I mean,
so not a big fan of Michael Anton and Claremont Institute, the West Coast Straussians, who regard Abraham Lincoln as the greatest president, and this guy, Brian McClanahan, he's much more of a states' rights and a federalist in his politics. All right, let's leave it